Welcome to Moonlit Insomniac. Tonight we'll drift back to a quieter time, to an attic room in 1883, where a single lantern glows over soft folds of silk and the gentle hands of a seamstress at work. The night will unfold slowly here, stitch by stitch, breath by breath, until the city sleeps and you do too. So settle in, let the day fall away, and allow this story to wrap around you like a warm quilt. Chapter 1. A room on the upper floor. It was a room you might have walked past 100 times without ever noticing. Up on the third floor of a narrow building along a cobblestone street, where the lamps outside glowed dimly and the shadows leaned against the walls, the seamstress's workroom waited in the quiet. The air held a kind of stillness that only comes at the close of a long day, not the brittle stillness of something unfinished, but the soft exhale of a space that knows its own rhythm. Here, time was a slow thread, weaving hour to hour with no rush to reach its end. The walls sloped inward just slightly, as if leaning close to listen. Their plaster bore a faint ivory hue, mellowed over years by lamplight and the warmth of the seasons. Beneath the window, a narrow table rested, its surface polished smooth by decades of work. Upon it lay neat stacks of folded fabric, cottons in pale cream, linens the color of morning fog, a length of dusky rose silk that caught the light, as though it had stored a sunset in its threads. The room smelled faintly of starch and lavender, a scent that came from the sachets she tucked into the fabric bundles. It was the kind of fragrance that belonged to the work, not deliberate yet always there, clinging like memory. By the far wall, a wooden mannequin stood patiently, a half-finished gown draped across its frame. The bodice was already taking shape, the curve of it soft yet precise, as though the fabric itself had decided to remember the lines of the woman who would wear it. Above all of this, near the center of the room, a single brass hook held the lantern. Unlit for now, it dangled slightly in the still air, waiting for the moment its flame would be coaxed to life. The seamstress always lit it the same way, not hurried, not distracted, but with the quiet attention of someone who understands that lighting a lamp is as much an act of ceremony as it is of necessity. Outside the window, the evening was folding itself over the city. The day's brightness had already slipped away into the narrow alleys, leaving behind a kind of gentle dusk that softened every edge. Carriage wheels clattered in the far distance, their sound rounded by the dampness of the night air. Somewhere, 2 streets over, someone was laughing, the sound carrying faintly before it disappeared into the fabric of the city's hum. Inside, the only movement came from the seamstress herself. She was small in frame, her hair pinned back in a way that left a few wisps free to catch the light. Her hands moved in slow arcs as she smoothed the gown over the form, fingertips reading the texture of the fabric as though it were a kind of braille meant only for her. Her chair, an old bentwood piece with a cushion faded from deep burgundy to a soft plum, was pulled close to the table. The cushion gave a faint sigh when she sat, and for a moment she rested there, hands in her lap, eyes half closed. It was the pause before the night's work began in earnest. This was the hour she liked best. The in-between hour, not quite day, not quite night. It was a seam in time, and she, a seamstress, felt its familiarity. The world outside grew quieter, yet she was not yet alone with the dark. She was still stitched to the city by the faint sounds below, but the thread was slack enough to let her breathe. Her gaze drifted to the lantern. She thought of the moment, only a few breaths away now, when its light would spread across the room. That glow was unlike sunlight, softer, more deliberate, as if aware that the night needed gentleness. In its light, colors deepened. Shadows behaved differently. The folds of fabric seemed to hold their own warmth, and even the air itself felt richer. For now, the lantern waited, and she let it. There was a pleasure in allowing the evening to settle first, in letting the stillness grow thick enough to be broken only by the sound of the match being struck. Her eyes roamed the room in slow appreciation. There were little things here that she did not consciously notice most days, but which tonight stood out in their quiet beauty. The frayed hem of the curtain that moved just slightly with the draught, the way the window glass caught the faintest ghost of her reflection, the row of thread spools along the shelf like a patient line of miniature soldiers. Each object carried a history. The scissors, worn smooth at the handles from years of use, had belonged to her mother, whose hands had taught hers. The thimble, with its tiny dent along one side, came from her first year in the city, when she'd worked long hours under the stern eye of a master tailor, and the small tin box, dented at one corner, still held the ivory buttons from a commission she had never been able to finish, because the young man who had ordered the shirt never returned to collect it. She touched that box sometimes, feeling the coolness of the metal, and wondered if somewhere in the city someone still wore the coat she had made him years before. The room, in its modest way, held all of this, the tangible pieces of her life stitched into the quiet. Below, the street shifted, the sound of hooves briefly louder, then fading again. The smell of rain on stone drifted upward, mingling with the faint starch and lavender air of the room. She leaned back in her chair, fingers brushing over the fabric on the table, and breathed in slowly. The night's work was ahead of her, but there was no urgency. Each stitch could be its own moment, each seam a small act of care. The city outside could hurry if it wished. Here, above the street, time belonged to her. Chapter 2. The lantern is lit. She rose from her chair with a slow, unhurried grace, her movements so quiet they barely stirred the air. The brass hook above the table held the lantern steady, its glass chimney faintly smudged from evenings past. She reached for the small box of matches, the wood worn pale where her thumb had pressed it open hundreds of times before. There was no rush. Lighting the lantern was never something to be done while thinking of the next thing. It was its own small ceremony, belonging to the moment and nothing beyond it. She drew a match from the box and paused, feeling the slim stick between her fingers. There was a certain texture to a match, faintly grainy, almost soft, that told her how it would catch. She closed the box, holding it in her palm for a breath, and then struck the match along its edge. The sound was sharp and brief, a small flare of orange leaping into the quiet. She cupped her hand to guard the flame, leaning close to the lantern's wick. With a gentle tilt, the flame met the waiting thread of cotton, and the lantern answered with its own small bloom of light. For a moment the flame flickered high, then settled into a steady glow. It filled the room with a golden warmth, as if it had reached into the fabric of the air and drawn out every hidden shade of amber. The light didn't push back the darkness so much as it invited it to soften. Shadows stretched along the walls, no longer sharp, but rounded at the edges. The folds of fabric on the table deepened in color. The cream cottons took on a honeyed hue. The dusky rose silk glowed richer, like the last blush of sunlight over a quiet field. Even the air itself seemed to take on weight and warmth, holding the scent of lavender and starch closer now. She stepped back to look, not at the lantern, but at the way it had changed the room. This was always her favorite part. The moment after the light had taken hold, when everything felt a little more alive, a little more secret. The room was no longer just a place where she worked. It was a small world, stitched together by light and shadow, where time could flow as slowly as it wished. Her gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, the city had deepened into blue, its outlines softened by the dusk. The lamplighter must have passed by earlier, for the gas lamps along the street below now glowed faintly, halos of gold floating in the night air. Far away, she caught the sound of carriage wheels again, slower this time, their rhythm as steady as the flame in her lantern. She returned to her chair, the cushions sighing under her once more. The light pooled on the table, spilling across her lap, catching the small shine of the thimble and the curve of her scissors handle. Her hands moved to the fabric, fingertips tracing along the seam she had left the night before. The needle lay ready in its pincushion, gleaming faintly in the lantern's glow. She took it up, threading it with a length of fine silk, and the thread caught the light as though it had been spun from something softer than gold. With the first small stitch, the rhythm of her work began again, slow, steady, unbroken. Outside, the night continued to fold itself over the city. Inside, she stitched, and the lantern burned on, its light a quiet companion in the room above the cobblestones. Chapter 3. The dress on the form. The mannequin stood where it always did, against the far wall, half in the golden light of the lantern, half in the gentle shadow of the sloping ceiling. It had been with her for years, longer than she had been in this little attic room, its wooden base worn smooth where her hands had turned it to catch the light. The gown draped over it tonight was the kind of work she did not often get to make. Not everyday wear, not a seam for a mended hem or a coat altered to fit a changing season. This was a dress meant for an evening, an occasion, a night that would be remembered for years afterward. The silk, a deep dusky rose, had been sent to her in careful folds from a merchant in Lyon, wrapped in paper so thin she could see the ghost of the fabric's sheen through it. Even before she had unwrapped it, she could feel its weight. Not heavy, but with that particular density that meant the threads were tightly woven, and the dye had been coaxed into the fibers with care. When she had first draped it over the mannequin, she had paused, letting the fabric fall the way it wanted to, studying how it behaved in the light. Silk could be temperamental, eager to please in one moment, slipping out of place the next. But this length seemed to have made a quiet agreement with her hands. It settled easily, holding the lines she coaxed it into, as though it had been waiting for this particular form all along. Tonight, under the lantern's soft glow, the bodice was already taking shape. She had cut it with a gentle curve, the kind that followed the body's lines without pressing them, so the wearer could breathe and move as easily as if she were wearing nothing more than a nightdress. The neckline dipped modestly, framed with the beginning of lace she had yet to finish. She stepped toward the mannequin, fingertips grazing the edge of the silk. The lantern's light moved across it in small waves, finding deeper tones where the folds met and soft blushes along the smoother planes. She traced the seam along the side, feeling where her stitches had drawn the fabric in just enough to shape it without strain. Her scissors rested on the table behind her, their steel edges catching a glint of light. Beside them, a neat coil of thread lay ready, the same rose tone spun so fine it could vanish into the fabric. She would use it tonight to finish the darts along the bodice, then perhaps begin the hidden closures at the back. The dress was more than fabric and thread. It was, in its way, a small container for a story. She did not know the full shape of that story, only fragments given in the commission. The woman who had ordered it had spoken in a low, deliberate voice, her hands folded around the strap of her bag as though she were holding herself together. She had wanted the gown ready in less than a fortnight. There had been no hesitation in her payment, no bargaining over the price, just a look in her eyes that had said, "This matters." The seamstress had not asked why. It was not her habit to pry into the lives of her clients, though pieces of their evenings often came back to her in bits of gossip overheard at the market, or in the sight of them walking past her building, dressed in something she had made. Now, as she worked, she wondered where this dress would go, and who might notice it. Would the woman walk into a room and feel every gaze draw toward her? Would she dance, or stand quietly in a corner, or slip out early under the cover of night? She reached for her thimble, sliding it onto her finger, and began to work the needle through the silk. Each stitch was small, deliberate, placed as though the gown would be inspected in the closest of candlelight. Her fingers moved without need of thought, the rhythm set long ago by years of practice. In and out, pull, smooth, in and out again. The sound was barely there, a faint whisper of thread through fabric. Now and then the silk gave a soft sigh, shifting under her touch. Outside the window, the city's night sounds continued their own quiet work, the murmur of a couple walking arm in arm, the distant creak of a cart's wheels, the occasional drip of water from a gutter above the street. These sounds did not intrude. They simply folded into the edges of her awareness, as much a part of the evening as the feel of the fabric in her hands. She stopped for a moment to check the line of the darts. The silk obeyed her shaping perfectly, curving gently along the bodice. She ran her palm over it, smoothing any invisible tension from the seam. The lantern's flame flickered slightly, as though nodding in approval. Her eyes traveled to the mannequin's wooden stand. A faint scratch ran across its surface, a mark from years ago when she had accidentally tipped the form into the table during a late night of work. That night had been winter, the air sharp enough to frost the inside of the window panes, and she had been hurrying to finish a coat before the snow began. She smiled at the memory, though at the time it had seemed a disaster. The dress before her now carried none of that haste. It was unfolding slowly, as though it had been made to keep pace with the deepening night. She liked it that way. She liked the feel of time expanding when her hands were steady and the light was warm, and the only thing asked of her was patience. She adjusted the lace at the neckline, pinning it in place. The lace was older than the silk, an heirloom from a client who had traded it for a piece of work years before. She had kept it carefully wrapped in tissue, waiting for the right garment to match its character. Now, as it lay against the rose silk, it seemed to belong, as though it had been spun for this very dress. In the quiet, she could almost hear the threads speaking, the silk in its soft, measured tone, the lace in a whisper of finer age, the cotton thread holding them together like a steady hand between two friends. Her needle moved again. The stitches along the neckline needed to be nearly invisible, strong enough to hold yet so fine they could disappear if the light shifted. This was the sort of work that demanded both focus and softness, a steadiness of hand paired with an ease of breath. From time to time she paused to look at the dress from a little distance. Standing back, she could see it as someone else might, as the client would when she came to collect it. There was a kind of magic in that moment, the seeing of the thing as whole, even when it was not yet finished. The lantern's light reached to the far corners of the room now, softening the shadows around the shelves and the folded stacks of cloth. The scent of lavender sachets was stronger here by the gown, mingling with the faint warm note of the burning oil. She thought again of the evening for which this gown was intended. Perhaps there would be music, not the rough rhythm of the taverns along the docks, but the kind that drifted from polished floors and high ceilings. She could almost imagine the way the silk would move, catching light as the wearer turned. Another row of stitches slid into place. The night outside had settled fully now. The lamplight beyond the window glowed softer, blurred by the slight fog that had crept in from the river. Somewhere, a horse snorted, the sound carrying briefly upward before dissolving into the stillness. She worked until the silk no longer needed her for the moment, until the seam lay perfectly flat and the lace rested as though it had grown there. Setting her needle aside, she smoothed the bodice once more, letting her hands memorize the feel of the work. This was always part of the process, not just the making, but the knowing of what had been made. The mannequin stood patient under her gaze, holding the gown as though it had been entrusted with a secret. The lantern burned steadily, its light pooling over the silk in soft waves. She stepped back, letting the room take in the sight as much as she did. The dress was not yet finished, but it was already itself. In the stillness that followed, she became aware again of her own breathing, of the faint creak of the chair as she lowered herself into it, of the way the city's sounds came and went like threads weaving in and out of a larger cloth. The work would continue tomorrow. Tonight, it had reached its place of pause, that quiet point where the fabric rests, the thread waits, and the light holds everything in its gentle hands. And so she let the gown be. Chapter 4. Threads between fingers. The thread was warm where it had passed through her fingers again and again. Not hot, just carrying that quiet heat that came from being worked, touched, and moved through the same patient motions for hours. She let it run lightly across the pad of her forefinger, feeling its fineness. Silk thread was a different creature than cotton, less willing to be hurried, more likely to twist and coil if handled carelessly. But when treated with a steady, even rhythm, it moved like water, sliding through fabric in smooth arcs. Her needle dipped and rose, the silver glint vanishing into the rose silk before reappearing an inch further along. It was the kind of work that could lull the body into a steady breathing, almost like sleep, but without losing the keen awareness of what her hands were doing. She could feel every detail, the tiny give of the fabric as the needle pierced it, the momentary catch where two layers met, the faint sigh as the thread settled into place. Each stitch was a note, and together they made a soundless song. Outside, the night pressed closer to the window panes. The glass reflected the room now more than it showed the street, the lantern's golden light floating there as if another world existed just beyond the surface. Sometimes she caught her own reflection in that glass, head bowed, hands in motion, face softened by the same light that gilded the folds of the gown. She thought of how long she had been sewing tonight. Time had lost its edge. No sharp minutes or hours, just the easy passing of moments stitched one to the next. The city below could be on the verge of dawn or only just settling into its evening, and she would not have known the difference without the clock. Her chair creaked faintly when she shifted her weight, but the sound was softened by the thick stillness in the room. On the table beside her, the scissors lay just far enough away to catch the lantern light along their blades. A small pile of finished work rested near them, seams now invisible, edges smoothed, darts shaped to follow the curve of the body they would soon fit. She lifted the dress from the mannequin slightly, letting the fabric settle into her lap so she could work the hem of the bodice. The silk pooled against her legs like warm water. It had a language of its own, the way it folded, the way it clung or slid, the way it caught light differently depending on its mood. She listened to it without needing words, adjusting her touch when it seemed to pull away, relaxing her hold when it softened. This was not a task to be rushed. She had seen work spoiled by haste, seams that puckered, hems that pulled tight, threads that knotted where they should have lain smooth. The silk would remember how it had been handled, even after it left her hands. From somewhere beyond the window, the distant rhythm of hoofbeats passed again, slower this time, then fading into the night. It reminded her of the sound of a treadle wheel, the same kind of steady, cyclical beat that could carry on for hours without feeling forced. She reached for the spool, letting the thread unwind across her fingers, then threaded the needle once more. The tip of the needle found the fabric without hesitation. In and out, pull, smooth, in and out again. Her thoughts drifted easily, while her hands continued the work. She imagined the dress moving, the woman wearing it turning in soft candlelight, the lace at the neckline catching the glow, the silk shifting with each breath. She wondered if the wearer would know how much of this evening, this quiet, had been stitched into the seams. The lace in her hands was older than she was, Its fine pattern had been made by someone she would never meet, long before she had taken her first stitch. That thought always made her pause, that she was not the beginning of the work, only a moment in its long life. The thread she used tonight might be unpicked decades from now by someone else's careful fingers, altered and remade for another evening entirely. Her fingers slowed. She smoothed the lace into place one last time, pinning it lightly before setting the gown back onto the mannequin. Stepping back, she studied it as though it belonged to someone else. The lantern's light poured over the silk, tracing every curve she had shaped. The shadows lay gently across it, as if the fabric had been sleeping and had only just begun to wake. She let her hands rest in her lap, simply looking. The work was not yet finished, but it had reached that point where it could stand on its own for the night. The thread in her fingers still held the memory of the last stitch, warm and ready, waiting for tomorrow. The gown stood quietly in the golden light, as though it had its own patience. Chapter 5. A dress stitched in quiet hours. The lantern burned steadily, a quiet sun suspended above her work, and the room around it seemed to lean in toward its glow. The air was warm now. In that subtle way, a small light can warm a small space, more through presence than heat. It was the kind of warmth that carried with it the weight of safety, of being enclosed and unseen by the vastness of the night outside. The seamstress set down her needle for a moment and flexed her fingers. They were nimble hands, still fine-boned and light despite the years they had carried scissors, cloth, pins and thread. The lines along her knuckles were soft shadows rather than sharp creases, the sort of hands that had worked, but had always worked with care. She rubbed at the base of her thumb where the motion of stitching sometimes left a dull ache, and then let her palms rest flat against the tabletop, feeling the cool grain of the wood under her skin. Her eyes wandered over the gown again. The silk had begun to take on its own life in the light, no longer just fabric stretched over a form, but something almost breathing. She could see how it caught the lantern's glow along the bodice, and then slipped into shadow along the folds of the skirt, the colors deepening and shifting like the surface of water in late evening. She thought of the first dress she had ever made on her own. She had been barely 15, working in a shop at the edge of the city where the air always smelled faintly of dye. The dress had been plain cotton, a dull cream color with a blue sash, nothing remarkable to anyone but her. She had stayed late that night, long after the others had gone, to finish it. The satisfaction had not been in its beauty, for it was not beautiful in any way that would draw comment, but in the fact that it was hers, from first cut to last stitch. She remembered carrying it home in both hands as though it might spill, even though it was nothing more than cloth and thread. Now, years later, the same feeling stirred when she looked at this gown, though her hands had stitched hundreds in between. The repetition had not dulled the quiet joy of creation. If anything, it had deepened it. Every garment held a piece of its making, and perhaps, she sometimes thought, a piece of its maker as well. She rose to stretch, stepping toward the window. The glass gave her back her own reflection first, a figure framed in the golden light, hair drawn loosely away from her face, the rose silk pooled on the table behind her. Beyond that, she could make out the soft blur of the street lamps along the lane, their light gentled by the fog that had crept in from the river. The city had a way of quieting itself in such weather, as though the air itself was urging it to hush. Her gaze drifted upward. In the narrow slice of sky between rooftops, she could see no stars, only a muted glow from somewhere far off, the reflection of the city's heart in the low clouds. It was not the kind of night to stand long at the window. Instead, she stepped back, letting the curtain fall softly into place, and returned to her work. The gown waited for her as it always did, patient and unhurried. She settled into her chair, its cushion releasing a faint sigh. The needle was cool again between her fingers, and she threaded it with fresh silk, the fine strand almost invisible against her skin. She began to stitch along the hem of the skirt. This was slower work than the bodice. Each fold needed to be coaxed into place, each stitch hidden within the curve of the fabric. The silk was cool where it slid over her hand, warm where it rested in her lap. It shifted with the smallest movement, sending ripples of shadow across its surface. Now and then she paused to smooth the fabric, pressing it lightly between her palms. The silk responded with the faintest of sighs, as though relieved to be guided rather than forced. From the street below came a muffled clatter, perhaps a cart passing over uneven stones, followed by silence. In that silence, she could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the shelf, though she rarely noticed it when she was working. It marked the moments, but the moments did not belong to it. They belonged to the rhythm of her hands and the soft pull of the thread. She reached for the lace, lifting it carefully from where it lay folded beside the gown. The pattern was delicate. Small flowers joined by looping vines, the work so fine that it seemed almost impossible it had been made by human hands. She laid it against the neckline again, adjusting the fall of it until it seemed to settle into the silk's own pattern of folds. As she began to attach it, her stitches were even smaller than before, slipping in and out of the lace's edges, disappearing into the silk as though they had never been. This was work for quiet evenings, work that asked for nothing more than attention and patience. Her thoughts wandered to the woman who would wear it. Would she notice the lace? Would she see the hours in it? Or would she simply feel that it belonged, without knowing why? Perhaps that was enough, for the work to be felt even if it was not seen. She continued until the lace was secured, the lantern's glow now catching on its tiny raised flowers. Leaning back, she let her eyes rest on the gown in its fullness. It was nearly complete, though not yet ready to leave her hands. Tomorrow she would finish the hem and check each seam, making sure every line was smooth, every edge as it should be. For now, the night was still hers. She set her work aside and reached for the small tin box on the shelf, the one with the dented corner and the cool metal that always felt the same, no matter the season. She opened it slowly, the faint scent of starch and old paper rising from within, and looked at the buttons resting there. They were not for this gown. She had other closures in mind, but she liked to take them out sometimes, to let their weight rest in her palm. They were smooth under her fingertips, each one slightly different, their edges worn by years of being moved from one place to another. She returned them to their place, closing the lid with a soft click. Then she crossed to the lantern and adjusted its flame slightly lower, letting the edges of the room grow softer still. The city outside might be stirring in some quarter, laughter spilling from a doorway, boots tapping along wet stones. But here, above the street, there was only this, a quiet room, a patient dress, and a light that seemed to carry its own hush. And in that hush she continued. Chapter 6. The Night's Gentle Binding. The gown was nearly whole now. Its shape had emerged over nights of quiet labor, its lines settling into a kind of inevitability, as though it had always been meant to take this form. The seamstress sat before it as she might before an old friend, the lantern's light resting along her cheek, casting a fine shadow beneath her lashes. Her hands hovered for a moment above the work, not from hesitation, but from a kind of reverence. There was a satisfaction in reaching this point, not the triumphant swell of completion, but a gentler acknowledgement that the journey from bolt of cloth to breathing garment was almost done. The silk held a life now, a warmth gathered from the hours it had been touched, folded, and stitched. She reached for her thimble again, sliding it over her finger. The motion was muscle memory, the fit familiar. A small sigh slipped past her lips as she drew the needle upward, its silver glint momentarily catching the light. before she lowered it again into the rose silk. This part, the finishing of the inner seams, was the kind of work few would see, yet it was work she cherished. Her stitches here were finer still, hidden away where they would never meet the eye, but would be felt in the way the dress moved, in how it held together against years of wear. From outside came the faintest chime of a clock tower. Its tone was muted by distance, softened further by the fog that still lingered along the lanes. She could not tell the hour and did not care to. Here in her workshop, time was measured differently. Each pass of the needle marked not minutes but moments. Breaths taken, thoughts wandered, tiny decisions made with the tilt of the hand or the angle of a stitch. The lantern's flame wavered slightly and her gaze followed its subtle dance. Shadows shifted across the folds of the gown, deepening the rose to something almost wine-dark in the recesses, then lifting it again to the blush of a dawn cloud along its curves. On the far wall, bolts of fabric rested in tidy stacks, their edges soft with the dim light. She knew each one by feel, the cool firmness of linen, the almost liquid drape of crepe, the steady grain of wool. But tonight none of them called to her. Tonight belonged to the silk, and to the quiet patience it asked of her. She adjusted her chair, the wood legs sliding a fraction against the worn floorboards. The sound was small but certain, like the acknowledgement of a companion settling into place. Thread slipped through her fingers. She kept the tension light, coaxing the seam into perfect alignment. The silk did not like to be forced. It rewarded patience with smoothness, punished haste with puckers. She had learned this long ago, and so her hands moved with the rhythm of one who knows that fabric remembers every touch. The warmth of the lantern gathered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of lavender that rose each time she shifted the gown across her lap. Somewhere beyond the walls, a horse's hoof struck stone, then another, the sound fading into the distance. Her mind, untethered from the need to rush, began to wander. She imagined the woman who had commissioned the gown standing in front of a mirror on the night of its wearing. Perhaps there would be a maid, hands deft and quick, fastening the closures down the back. Perhaps the woman would reach up to touch the lace at her neckline, feeling its softness against her skin, not knowing the hours stitched into its edge. She could almost hear the murmur of voices in the imagined room, the faint scent of perfume mingling with candle smoke. A carriage waiting below, perhaps. A night not yet begun. The seamstress's eyes softened as she pulled the thread through and set another stitch. There was a kind of intimacy in making something for a stranger, a connection forged through touch and attention, through the quiet knowing of measurements and movement. She paused to smooth the silk with both hands, pressing gently along the curve of the seam. The fabric shifted beneath her touch, sending small ripples of shadow across the skirt. She let her palms linger, feeling the cool surface warm slightly under her skin. The ticking of the small clock on the shelf became noticeable again, marking the steady passage of the evening. She glanced at it without really reading the time, then returned her gaze to the gown. Beyond the window, the fog had thickened. The street lamps outside were now halos of light, their posts vanishing into the haze. The city's sounds seemed further away, softened to a kind of hush that belonged more to winter than to this mild night. She reached for a new length of thread, drawing it from the spool with slow care. The thread caught the light as it unrolled, a fine glimmer before settling once more into shadow. Her hands resumed their work, the needle dipping and rising with the same calm rhythm. Each stitch bound the fabric together, but it also seemed to bind the night around her, the quiet, the warmth, the faint drift of thought. The work drew her inward, into that space where the outside world fell away and all that existed was the slip of silk under her hands and the steady movement of the needle. Now and then she leaned back, letting her eyes rest on the whole gown, its form poised and waiting. It was a moment she treasured, seeing the thing as both maker and observer, aware of its flaws and yet moved by its beauty. The lace along the neckline was complete now, its delicate flowers catching and releasing the lantern's glow as she shifted the garment. The hem was next, and she turned the dress carefully, letting the skirt pool across the table like poured wine. She began at the side seam, folding the raw edge under and guiding the needle through both layers with care. The hem was long, the work repetitive, but there was peace in it. The peace of knowing that the end was near, but that the journey there would be unhurried. Outside, the muffled roll of a cart's wheels drifted upward, followed by the faint call of a street vendor selling something warm for the late wanderers. The sound faded, replaced once more by stillness. Her shoulders relaxed as she continued. The silk moved easily under her hands now, the earlier stiffness of the unworked fabric long gone. It had been handled enough to trust her, to yield to her shaping. The lantern's flame burned steady again, its small warmth holding back the night's cool fingers. Shadows lay soft against the walls, stretching long and low across the floorboards. The seamstress's breathing matched the rhythm of her stitching. In and out, in and out. She could feel the calm settling in her chest, in the looseness of her jaw, in the gentle curve of her shoulders. By the time she reached the last few inches of the hem, she was moving almost without thought, her hands guided by something deeper than conscious decision. The final stitch slid into place, the thread drawn taut, and she secured it with the quiet certainty of one who has done this 1,000 times. She did not yet declare the gown finished. That moment would come tomorrow in daylight, when her eyes could catch any tiny imperfection the lantern's glow might hide. For now, it was enough to let it rest, draped across the mannequin, its skirt falling in soft waves toward the floor. She set her tools aside, folding her hands in her lap for a long, still moment. The night was deep now, but she felt no urge to sleep. Instead, she simply sat, breathing in the warm, lavender-touched air, letting the quiet seep into her bones. The gown stood waiting, the lantern still burning low beside it. And for the seamstress, the night felt whole. Chapter 7. The Hours Between. The night had deepened into the kind of stillness that seemed to have a weight of its own. Outside, the fog pressed close to the walls of the buildings, softening the shapes of roofs and chimneys until they looked like shadows of themselves. The lamps along the street had taken on a muted halo, their light trembling slightly in the damp air. Up in the workshop, the seamstress had not yet gone to bed. She sat with her chair angled toward the table, one elbow resting lightly against its edge, the other hand curled loosely around the stem of her teacup. The tea was no longer hot, but the faint scent of chamomile lingered, drifting upward each time she moved it. She had not made another stitch since setting the gown on the mannequin. The sight of it there, standing quietly in the lantern's glow, was enough. The skirt hung in perfect stillness, the folds spilling downward with the slow grace of water flowing over stone. The lace along the neckline caught just enough light to reveal its pattern, tiny blossoms in a winding chain. The mannequin itself had grown familiar to her over the years, though it bore no resemblance to any real figure. Its surface was scuffed in places, the cloth covering worn smooth where countless pins had been pressed and pulled away. Yet it was steady, patient, never asking for rest, holding the shape of each garment until it was ready to leave. She set down the teacup and rose, her bare feet making almost no sound on the floorboards. Moving closer to the mannequin, she lifted the skirt slightly and let it fall again, watching the way the fabric settled. She traced her fingers along one of the seams, feeling the firmness of the stitches beneath the silk. It was nearly finished. The last day's work would be for the small things, the hooks and eyes along the back, the final pressing of the seams, the trimming of any wandering threads that had escaped her notice. These were the details that no one would remark on, but which would make the dress feel complete. Her gaze drifted to the window. The glass reflected more of the room than it did the outside world. The lantern's golden glow, the gentle rise of steam from the tea, the faint shadow of her own figure standing in the middle of it all. The fog beyond was like a veil, hiding the city's edges, quieting its noise. Somewhere far away, a bell tolled the hour. She could not tell if it was midnight or later. The sound reached her softened, the way sound carries when it has traveled through streets and over rooftops. She imagined it passing over the heads of those still awake. A carriage driver guiding his horse home, a woman carrying a lantern across a narrow alley, a watchman leaning against the corner post before reaching her window. She turned from the mannequin and crossed to her work table. There a small pile of fabric scraps lay gathered in a neat stack. Some were no larger than her palm, others long enough to drape across her forearm. She picked one up, a strip of the rose silk, its edges frayed, and rubbed it lightly between her fingers. Even the smallest piece carried the same texture, the same faint sheen. Many seamstresses would discard such scraps without thought, but she liked to keep them. Sometimes they became ribbons for hair, sometimes linings for pockets, sometimes nothing more than a strip of fabric tucked into a drawer for no reason other than to be touched again. She reached for her tin of buttons, opening it slowly. The light from the lantern glanced off their curved surfaces, a dozen small moons in varying shades of pearl and brass. Her fingers sifted through them, the sound soft and irregular, like pebbles shifting underwater. Setting the tin aside, she leaned over the table, her hands braced lightly on its surface. Her eyes wandered over the tools laid there, the small shears with the worn handles, the measuring tape curled in a loose spiral, the pincushion bristling with silver pins. Each one had its own place, not by strict order, but by the ease of habit. She thought of the first time she had worked in a space like this, not her own, but the shop where she had learned as a girl. The air had been heavy with the scent of wool and dye, and the windows had been small, letting in only thin strips of daylight. Yet she had loved it. The sense that within those walls something was always being made, that the work of the hands could change the shape of the world, even if only in the smallest ways. Her own workshop was quieter. The air was lighter, scented faintly with lavender from the sachets she kept in the fabric cupboard. The floorboards creaked in familiar ways. The light fell warmly through the larger windows by day, and by night the lantern's glow softened every corner. She returned to her chair, lifting the teacup once more and taking a small sip. The chamomile had cooled, but the flavor lingered, warm and steady. She set it down again and rested her hands in her lap, letting her shoulders drop, her gaze softening. The dress would not leave her for another day, but she could already feel the space its absence would leave in the room. Each gown carried with it the hours of its making, and when it left, those hours seemed to go with it. The table would look too clear, the mannequin too bare. For a moment she imagined the gown on its journey, folded carefully into tissue, laid into a box, carried down the street to the waiting carriage. It would ride through the city, past shuttered shops and lamplit corners until it reached the house where it would be worn, and there it would begin its next life, one she would not see but could picture in quiet fragments. She stood once more and approached the gown. Her hands hovered over the fabric, not touching it now, simply resting in the air above it as though to seal something invisible into its shape. A kind of blessing, though she would never have thought to call it that. The lantern's light deepened the shadows in the folds, turning them into soft valleys. She stepped back, letting the sight settle in her mind, and then crossed to the lantern itself. With a small twist of the knob, she lowered the flame until the room was almost entirely in shadow, the gown now only a suggestion in the dimness. She sat again, leaning back in her chair, letting her gaze rest on nothing in particular. The quiet was complete. Not even the clock seemed to intrude now. She breathed in, slow and deep, and let her thoughts drift in the space between one stitch and the next. And there, in those hours between night and dawn, she stayed, the gown waiting, the work resting, and the city outside holding its breath. Chapter 8. A cup of tea by the window. The first hint of morning had not yet touched the city, and the fog outside was thick enough to turn the street lamps into pale, floating orbs. The seamstress had not gone to bed. Instead, she found herself standing at the small window of her workroom, cradling a cup of tea between her hands. The cup was simple porcelain, a faint chip along its rim, its surface smooth and warm against her palms. She had brewed chamomile again, the kind she kept in a small tin, leaves pale and dry, carrying with them the faintest whisper of summer fields. Steam curled upward, gathering for a moment before dissolving into the still air. She sipped slowly, letting the warmth spread through her mouth and down into her chest. The taste was gentle and floral, the kind that lingered without pressing itself forward. It was a tea made for quiet moments, for pausing, for watching, for simply existing in the in-between. Outside the window, the world was muffled. The fog had softened every edge, blurring the rooftops and swallowing the details of the street below. From her high vantage point, the street seemed more like a dream than a place where feet would walk and wheels would turn in a few short hours. She leaned slightly on the windowsill, feeling the cool wood beneath her arm. The grain was worn smooth from years of leaning there, and in certain light she could see faint scratches and marks, small signatures left by time and habit. Below, the cobblestones glistened faintly with moisture. Somewhere in the distance a carriage passed, its wheels softened by the damp air until the sound was no more than a slow, rhythmic murmur. The horse's hooves made a muted beat, steady but unhurried. She brought the cup closer to her lips again, breathing in the steam before sipping. The warmth was welcome against the faint chill that drifted in from the glass. Her workroom was never fully warm in the small hours. The lantern provided a glow but little real heat. Yet she found she preferred it this way. The slight coolness kept her alert, her senses tuned to the fabric, the thread, the shifting air. Her eyes drifted to the gown still resting on the mannequin in the corner of the room. Even from here it seemed to carry its own quiet presence. The rose silk caught the lantern's dimmed light, holding it along the bodice before letting it fade into shadow in the folds of the skirt. The lace along the neckline lay soft and steady, the tiny flowers seeming almost asleep. It struck her again how strange it was to spend so many hours in the intimate company of something she was making, to know every line, every seam, every hidden knot of thread, and then to let it go. A dress like this would not stay with her. It would move out into the world, into rooms she would never enter, into moments she would never witness, and yet in some way her hands would always be there in the fabric. She set the cup down on the sill and drew her shawl closer around her shoulders. The fabric was a soft wool, dyed a faded blue, frayed in one corner. It had belonged to her mother, and she wore it on nights like this, not so much for warmth as for the sense of comfort it carried. For a while she simply stood there, letting her gaze rest on nothing in particular. The city was asleep beneath the fog, and the quiet was so complete that she could almost imagine she was the only one awake. The thought was not lonely, it was spacious, a kind of solitude that allowed the mind to wander without interruption. Eventually she stepped back from the window, her bare feet making a whisper against the floorboards. The tea was still warm enough to drink, and she carried it back to her chair near the table. She sat slowly, curling one hand around the cup, the other resting lightly against the fabric of her skirt. The gown was close enough now that she could see the subtle play of light along its surface. She reached out and let her fingers graze the silk, careful not to disturb its shape. The fabric was cool under her touch, smooth as water, shifting slightly at the lightest pressure. She remembered a gown she had made years ago in a similar shade, though the fabric had been heavier then, less fluid. That one had been for a winter evening, its bodice lined with a thin layer of wool, the hem trimmed with a darker ribbon. She had often wondered what became of it, if it had been worn more than once, if it had been tucked away in a cedar chest somewhere, sleeping in darkness. Her tea cooled as she thought, but she did not mind. The act of holding it was as much the point as drinking it. She liked the weight in her hands, the small curl of steam, the way it seemed to mark the moment as belonging to itself. The lace at the neckline of the current gown drew her attention again. She leaned forward, studying it in the softened light. Her stitches were invisible, just as they should be. The flowers seemed almost to breathe, their edges catching the glow and releasing it again as she moved her head slightly from side to side. She set the cup on the table and reached for her pincushion. There were a few loose threads along the inside of the bodice she had noticed earlier, and now felt like the right time to tend to them. She slid the needle through with the ease of habit, her hands steady even in the dimness. The thread moved smoothly, and the silk yielded without resistance. Outside, the faintest light was beginning to touch the fog, not enough to lift it, but enough to change its color from deep gray to something softer. The lamps along the street seemed to dim in response, though she knew it was only the growing day that made them appear so. She worked in silence, the only sound the faint slip of the needle and the occasional soft clink of her teacup against the porcelain saucer. Her breathing matched the rhythm of her hands, slow and even, a quiet tide in the stillness. When she finished the last thread, she sat back and let her eyes rest on the gown again. It looked as it had before, no grand change, but she knew the difference. The inside was cleaner now, smoother, more ready to move with the body it would soon clothe. She reached for her tea, now barely warm, and drank the last few sips. The chamomile was faint but still there, a soft echo on her tongue. She set the cup aside and pulled the shawl closer, leaning back in her chair. The day would come soon enough, bringing with it the small bustle of the street below, the light through the window, the final touches to the gown. But for now, the room was hers alone, a lantern-lit world where the air smelled faintly of lavender and tea, where the silk caught the dim light like water, and where the hours could stretch as far as they wished. And so she stayed there, watching the first pale hints of morning mingle with the fog, her hands resting in her lap, her work waiting quietly beside her. Chapter 9. The clock chimes 8. The fog had thinned just enough for the rooftops across the street to emerge, though they were still softened at the edges, as if painted with a brush that had been dipped once in mist. The seamstress sat at her work table, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, the cup of tea from earlier now rinsed and set upside down to dry. The light outside had shifted from the blue-grey of early dawn to something warmer, though the sun itself was still hidden. The clock on the narrow shelf above her sewing tools gave a small mechanical sigh, as though preparing itself. Then, with a sound that was both measured and unhurried, it struck 8. Each chime carried through the quiet room with a gentle authority, like the voice of a neighbor calling from across a still courtyard. She let the sound fill the air, each note lingering before giving way to the next. She did not always notice the clock. In the deep hours of night when she worked by lantern light, its ticking seemed only a faint companion, an occasional reminder that time still passed beyond the small world of fabric and thread. But in the mornings, the chime felt different, a marking of transition, as if the day itself had stepped into the room. Her eyes shifted to the gown on the mannequin. In daylight, the rose silk revealed colors the lantern could not coax from it. The folds of the skirt held warm undertones now, the soft gold of morning light resting gently on their surface. The lace at the neckline seemed almost new again, its pale threads bright against the deeper hue of the bodice. She rose from her chair, stretching her arms until her joints gave the faintest crack. The floorboards were cool beneath her bare feet as she crossed to the gown. She walked slowly, not out of tiredness, but in the deliberate pace of someone savoring a moment. The hem swayed slightly as she passed, touched by the shift in air. With both hands she lifted a portion of the skirt and let it fall again, watching how the silk moved. It was a small ritual she often repeated in the final days of work, an unspoken way of speaking with the fabric, listening to how it draped, how it returned to rest. The light from the window fell directly across the mannequin now, tracing a soft highlight along the curve of the bodice. She stepped to one side, letting her own shadow slip away so she could see the gown without her presence altering it. In the quiet, she could hear the faint street sounds below, the creak of a wagon's axle, the slow tread of footsteps on damp stone, the low murmur of a voice too far away to carry words. She turned slightly toward the window. The street was beginning to stir in its unhurried way. A vendor pulling open the shutters of a small shop, a boy sweeping water from the steps into the gutter. The air smelled faintly of wet stone, of the faint sweetness that comes after rain, even when the sky has not broken open in days. Returning to the table, she gathered her tools. Today's work would be light, no long seams to stitch, no new lace to attach. Instead, it was the work of finishing, securing hooks and eyes along the back, trimming threads, pressing the bodice so that each line lay smooth. She chose a small needle, finer than most, and threaded it with cotton instead of silk. The cotton was less visible in this work, less likely to slip. She began with the closures, working from the top of the bodice downward, each small hook sewn with precise, even stitches. The rhythm was different now, no longer the long sweep of a hem or the measured curve of a dart, but the small, concentrated motions of detail work. Her hands were steady, her breath even, the world beyond her fingertips narrowing to the silver glint of the hook and the tiny loop of thread binding it to the fabric. When she finished the last closure, she sat back and let her gaze soften, checking for alignment. All was as it should be. She smiled faintly, not with pride exactly, but with the quiet satisfaction of seeing something settled into its right place. The clock ticked on, its face half in shadow. She glanced toward it, not to note the time, but to feel the way the morning was unfolding in her workshop. Outside, the street had grown a little livelier, the sound of a cart being unloaded, the rattle of bottles in a crate, the low laughter of two women passing below her window. She reached for the small scissors and began trimming the loose threads she had left deliberately over the past week. Each snip was followed by a small pause, her fingers brushing over the spot to ensure it was clean. She placed the threads in a small ceramic dish, a habit she had formed years ago. There was no real reason to keep them, yet she did. A tiny archive of the making, soon to be discarded when the dress left her care. When the trimming was done, she lifted the gown gently from the mannequin and carried it to the table. The silk rustled softly against her forearms, a sound like a whispered agreement. She laid it flat, smoothing the bodice first, then the skirt. From beneath the table, she drew a small iron, the kind that could be heated on the stove, though this one was still faintly warm from earlier. She pressed the fabric with slow, deliberate movements, letting the heat sink in before moving on. The steam rose in thin, fleeting curls, carrying with it the faint scent of the silk itself. Not a perfume, but a kind of clean, quiet warmth. The lace was pressed last, with only the lightest touch to keep its pattern crisp without flattening its depth. When she was finished, she stood for a moment looking down at the gown spread across the table. It seemed both familiar and new, hers in every detail, yet already belonging to the life it would soon step into. The clock on the shelf gave a small click, the sound that signaled the minute hand shifting forward. She realized the hour had moved without her noticing. The chimes of 8 still lingered in her mind, though they were now some distance behind her. She folded the gown carefully, laying tissue between each layer, and placed it in the box she had prepared. The box itself was plain, the kind that would not draw the eye, but inside it held the hours of her work, the quiet weight of her attention. Closing the lid, she rested her hands on it for a moment before tying it with a narrow ribbon. She did not think of this as a farewell. The gown was simply moving on, as all her work did, into the wide and unseen places of the world. She set the box aside, ready for collection later in the day, and turned toward the window once more. The fog had almost lifted now, leaving only a thin haze above the rooftops. Sunlight touched the far edge of the street, catching in the small pools of water gathered between the cobblestones. The chimes had marked the start of this day's work, and now they seemed to echo faintly in her mind as she stood, hands folded, watching the light grow. The city was waking. The gown was ready, and in the workshop above the street, the seamstress let herself simply be still. Chapter 10. A delivery from the milliner. The fog outside had thinned to a pale veil by the time the seamstress heard the soft knock at her door. It was not the kind of knock that startled or demanded, but one that seemed to respect the quiet of the building. A gentle, measured tapping, as though the visitor was aware of the hour's stillness. She set aside the length of cotton she had been folding and crossed the room. The latch gave its familiar click, and when she opened the door, the cool air of the hallway slipped in, carrying with it a faint scent of damp stone from the street below. On the landing stood a boy of perhaps 12, his cap pushed low over his brow, a small wooden box held carefully in both hands. His coat was worn but neat, and a wisp of hair curled at his temple where the fog had touched it. "From Madame Rousseau," he said softly, his voice polite but brisk, as though the words were part of a well-rehearsed delivery. He offered the box forward. The seamstress accepted it with both hands, feeling the slight weight shift inside as she took it. "Thank you," she said, her voice matching the quiet tone of the hall. The boy gave a small nod, tipping his cap slightly before turning to make his way back down the stairs. His footsteps were light, almost as though he was trying not to disturb the building any more than necessary. She closed the door and stood for a moment with the box in her hands. It was no larger than a loaf of bread, the wood smooth and faintly scented with cedar. The lid was tied with a narrow strip of twine, the kind easily loosened but secure enough to keep the contents from shifting. Carrying it to the work table, she set it down and drew her shawl a little closer. The air near the window was still cool despite the hour, and she could feel the faint draft moving against her back. Madame Rousseau was the milliner she had worked with for years. Their partnership was a quiet one, bound by mutual respect for each other's craft. The seamstress often sent gowns to clients who had their hats made by Madame Rousseau, and in return the milliner would send over trimmings, ribbons, or the occasional decorative piece that could turn a simple dress into something with a hint of Parisian grace. She slipped the twine loose and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in layers of pale tissue, were several items arranged with the kind of care that only someone who understood fabric and texture would take. First, she lifted out a length of ribbon, satin, in the same muted rose as the gown waiting by the mannequin. She brushed it lightly between her fingers, noting the way it held its shape yet yielded at the edges. It would be perfect for the waist, a soft accent that would not overpower the lace. Beneath the ribbon lay a small spray of silk flowers. Their petals were delicate, each one shaded from cream to blush, and their centers held tiny glass beads that caught the light like morning dew. They were arranged on a slender stem wrapped in fine wire, flexible enough to shape along a neckline or pin into a bodice. She smiled faintly as she turned them in her hand, imagining where they might best rest on the gown. Perhaps just at the left shoulder where they could peek from beneath the lace, or at the waist where the ribbon would tie. The third piece was a narrow strip of fine netting, soft, airy, almost weightless. It was not for the gown itself, she suspected, but an extra touch Madame Rousseau had included, knowing the seamstress might find use for it in some other project. She set each item carefully on the table, the tissue paper rustling faintly as she did. Then she replaced the lid on the box, sliding it to the corner of the table where she kept things that were not yet needed but should remain close at hand. The light from the window fell across the satin ribbon now, bringing out its quiet sheen. She reached for it again, running the length of it between her fingers, feeling for any imperfections. There were none. Madame Rousseau's eye for quality was as sharp as her own. From her drawer she took a small pair of embroidery scissors and trimmed the ribbon's ends into neat angles. The sound of the blades meeting was soft but distinct, a brief punctuation in the otherwise unbroken quiet of the room. She crossed to the mannequin and held the ribbon against the gown's waistline. Even without fastening it, she could see how it would change the balance of the dress, drawing the eye just enough to the center without distracting from the flow of the skirt. With a few straight pins, she secured it loosely, stepping back to see the effect from a distance. The gown seemed to breathe differently now, the line of the waist more defined, the silk of the skirt falling with a slightly new grace. She removed the pins again. The ribbon would be stitched in place later once she had decided on the final position. For now, it was enough to know how it would work. The silk flowers came next. She held them against the bodice, first at the shoulder, then at the waist. Both positions pleased her in different ways, and she considered leaving the decision until the client's fitting. There was a kind of pleasure in allowing the gown to speak for itself in such matters, in waiting for the right moment to see where it wished to carry its accents. The morning had deepened while she worked. The fog was nearly gone now, leaving the street below washed in the pale gold of late morning light. She could hear the faint rhythm of a broom sweeping the cobblestones, the call of a woman selling bread from a cart, the low rumble of a passing carriage. She returned to the work table and placed the ribbon and flowers back in the tissue, leaving them untied so she could reach for them easily later. The netting she folded neatly and slipped into a drawer, where it would rest until the right project called for it. For a moment she sat with her hands resting lightly on the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingertips. She thought of Madame Rousseau, likely in her own workshop just a few streets away, perhaps tying the last bow on a hat destined for some evening affair. Their work might be different in form, but it shared the same heart, the same quiet devotion to detail, to the way small touches could change the way something was seen or felt or remembered. She looked again at the gown on the mannequin, the rose silk now familiar as her own reflection, and imagined it paired with a hat from Madame Rousseau's hand, perhaps a brim just wide enough to cast a shadow across the eyes, trimmed with ribbon and flowers that matched those now resting on her table. The thought pleased her, not because of how it might look, but because it would mean the work of two craftspeople meeting in the same moment, each touch invisible to most, but essential to the whole. A soft gust stirred the curtain at the window, bringing with it the faint scent of baking bread from the street below. She breathed it in, then let it go, turning back to her work. The gown was ready for its final touches, and the morning was still hers to give them. Chapter 11. A Song from the Street. The first notes reached her before she realized they were music. They came lightly, almost like the accidental sound of wind moving through something hollow, until the shape of the melody began to form. Hesitant at first, then clearer, finding its way into the stillness of the room. She paused with the gown in her lap, her needle mid-air, and turned her head slightly toward the open window. The street below was not usually a place for music at this hour. In the early part of the day, It was filled with the purposeful rhythms of brooms sweeping cobblestones, cartwheels rattling over uneven stones, and the rise and fall of voices bartering over bread or fabric. Yet now, in this soft pocket of late morning, the usual clatter had fallen away, replaced by the warm, unhurried sound of a man's voice. It was a song she did not know, something lilting and low, as though the singer had no audience but the air itself. The words were in another language, the vowels drawn out. The consonants softened until they seemed to dissolve before they reached her. She set the needle down and moved to the window, careful not to disturb the ribbon and flowers resting on the table. Leaning her forearms on the sill, she peered down through the drifting curtain of light. The fog was gone entirely now, leaving the street washed in pale gold. There, near the fountain, stood the source of the voice, a man in a dark coat with a small lute cradled against his chest. His head was bowed slightly, his fingers moving along the strings with a tenderness that matched the tone of his song. A few passers-by had slowed to listen, though most continued on their way, their steps quick and purposeful. But those who paused seemed caught in the same quiet net she now felt, that sense of time loosening, its edges softening until the moment was all there was. She did not know why the sound moved her. Perhaps it was the way it seemed untouched by hurry, or the way the melody swayed like light on water. It reminded her, faintly, of something she could not name. Not a memory exactly, but the feeling a memory might leave behind. The song's rise and fall settled into her like a slow breath. She stood for a while, letting it fill the room behind her, the notes weaving themselves into the folds of the gown still waiting on the chair. When the last chord faded, the man lifted his head, and for a brief moment his eyes seemed to find hers, though she could not be sure at this distance. Then he turned, tucking the lute close as he began to walk down the lane, his steps unhurried. She lingered at the window until he was gone, watching the play of sunlight across the cobblestones, the shifting shadows of people moving through the street. When she returned to her chair, the room seemed warmer, though she had not touched the lantern's flame. She took the gown into her lap again and threaded the needle, her fingers moving with the familiar steadiness that came from years of practice. The stitches began to fall into place, each one as quiet as the next, yet now they seemed to carry a new rhythm, as though the song had left something behind for her to work with. Her hands moved, her thoughts wandering without hurry. She imagined the gown on the woman it was meant for, imagined her stepping into a room filled with light, a faint trace of music hanging in the air. She wondered if the wearer might feel, without knowing why, the gentle weight of this morning sewn into the seams. The clock ticked on the shelf, the sound as steady as her needle. Somewhere in the street below, the bread seller called out again, her voice bright and clear. She tied off the last stitch and smoothed the fabric beneath her palms. The silk felt different now, not in its texture, but in the way it met her hands, as if it too had been listening. She placed the gown back on the mannequin and stepped away to see it as a whole. The ribbon and flowers still waited on the table, but she could already picture where they would rest, as though the song from the street had whispered the answer to her. The day moved forward, but she carried that melody with her, not in her ears, but somewhere quieter, where it could hum along with the thread, unnoticed yet unforgotten. Chapter 13. Threads in the Quiet. The afternoon had grown quieter still, as though the whole lane had settled into a slower heartbeat. Even the light seemed gentler now, no longer streaming in sharply but drifting, as if it too had decided there was no reason to hurry. Inside the workroom, the air carried that faint, warm scent of pressed fabric and the lingering whisper of lavender sachets tucked between folded bolts. The gown stood where she had left it, the rose silk catching light in ways that made it seem almost like a living thing. She moved toward it without thinking, her hands finding the fabric at the waist to smooth it once more. The bodice was finished now, the seams hidden so neatly that even she, who knew exactly where each one lay, could barely see them. On the table, the spool of silk thread rested beside her scissors, their blades catching a pale glint from the window. She sat, letting her body settle into the chair in the way it always did when she knew she had hours of steady work ahead. The hem waited for her next. It was a kind of work that encouraged stillness. Each stitch was small, almost invisible, and had to be placed with care so the fabric's weight would fall exactly as it should. She drew the needle through, the thread sliding after it in a smooth, unbroken line. In and out, in and out. The rhythm quiet but certain. Every so often she would pause to smooth the silk across her lap, the fabric shifting like water under her palms. She could feel the coolness where it hadn't touched her hands yet, the faint warmth where it had. From somewhere beyond the window came the slow, rolling sound of cartwheels, followed by the soft clop of hooves. It passed without urgency, the sounds fading as gently as they had arrived. She thought of all the gowns she had worked on over the years. Some had been hurried, deadlines pressing, clients restless, the work rushed to meet a date. Others, like this one, had been allowed to unfold in their own time. She preferred those. The cloth seemed to know when it was being hurried, and it resisted in ways that were almost human, puckering at seams, slipping at hems, refusing to settle until it was given the time it asked for. This silk, she thought, had been patient from the beginning. It had let her guide it without fuss, and now, in its nearly finished state, it seemed to rest in quiet trust. The thread in her fingers warmed as it passed again and again through the fabric. The repetition was soothing, not mindless, but the kind that allowed thoughts to drift and soften. She found herself remembering the market where she had first seen this silk, folded neatly in the corner of a stall, its sheen muted in the shadow until she had lifted it toward the light. The merchant had told her it came from far away, though she had suspected that was simply a story to justify its price. Still, she had bought it, carrying it home with the quiet certainty that it would one day become something worth the keeping. Now here it was, almost ready to leave her hands. The lace along the neckline caught the fading light as she shifted the gown in her lap, its tiny flowers casting faint shadows across the silk. She ran her thumb along it, feeling the rise of each thread, the slight irregularities that told her it had been made by hand. Outside, a door closed somewhere along the lane, the sound carrying upward before being absorbed by the thick stillness of the hour. She reached the end of the hem and tied off the thread, the knot small and hidden within the folds. Lifting the gown carefully, she returned it to the mannequin, letting it fall into place with a slow, settling sigh of fabric. Stepping back, she studied it from a distance. The shape was right, the proportions true. It looked as though it had always been meant to exist in this form, as though it had only been waiting for her to uncover it from within the cloth. Her gaze lingered on it for a long while. She could almost see the evening ahead for the gown, the candlelight glancing off its folds, the soft movement as its wearer turned, the whisper of lace against skin. The thought made her smile, though faintly, the way one does when they are pleased without needing to explain it to themselves. She turned toward the table and began tidying her tools. The scissors went back to their place, the remaining spool of thread wrapped carefully so it would not tangle. The pins slid back into their small cushion, their tiny heads catching the light. The room felt lighter now, as though some quiet part of the work had been completed beyond just the sewing. She knew there would still be small adjustments in the morning, but for tonight it was enough. She lit the second lantern near the shelf, its flame catching slowly before settling into a steady glow. The twin lights made the shadows softer, the corners of the room warmer. Outside, the sky had begun to change, not yet the deep blue of evening, but touched with the faintest gold at its edges. She stood by the window for a moment, watching the light shift across the rooftops. the smoke from a nearby chimney curling into the cooling air. When she returned to her chair, she did not pick up the gown again. Instead, she rested her hands in her lap and let her eyes wander over the familiar shapes of the workroom. The stacked cloth, the neat row of tools, the patterns rolled and tied with ribbon. Each thing had its place. Each place held its quiet purpose. She sat there until the clock marked another hour, the sound gentle and unhurried. Then she rose, adjusting the flame of the nearest lantern until it dimmed, and let the room grow still again. The gown waited in its place, the silk breathing softly in the light. Tomorrow, she thought, would bring the final touches. But tonight belonged to the quiet. Chapter 14. The Last Light Before Evening. The light in the workroom had begun to mellow, taking on that tone that comes just before the sun withdraws completely. It was not yet night, but the edges of things were softening, corners rounding in shadow, colors settling into deeper shades. The seamstress stood by the table, her fingers resting lightly on the rose silk, as though to remind it, and herself, that the work was still in hand. She had been careful to leave the gown where it could catch the last natural light of the day, letting the silk drink in every shifting shade of gold and amber before the lantern would be lit. She took up her needle again. The thread was fresh, drawn from the spool with a smooth, steady pull so it would not twist on itself. She licked the end, a small, unthinking gesture learned in girlhood, and guided it through the fine eye of the needle. Then she knotted it neatly, holding the knot between her thumb and forefinger for a brief moment before letting it rest against the silk. The stitches she made now were not for structure but for refinement. Tiny, nearly invisible adjustments along the bodice ensured that the fabric would sit perfectly, with no pulling or shifting when the wearer moved. These were the kind of details no one would ever see, but she would know, and that was enough. A sigh of fabric followed each pass of the needle, the silk settling, the thread drawing close, the folds smoothing under her palm. Outside the window, a faint wind stirred, moving the curtain just enough to let the scent of damp stone and distant river reach her. She had worked through many such afternoons, the hours melting one into another until they became a single, continuous moment. It was in these moments that she felt most herself, her breath unconsciously matching the rhythm of her hands, her thoughts neither fully here nor elsewhere. From somewhere below came the sound of a door closing, a low, hollow thump softened by the air. She glanced toward the window but did not rise to look. The outside world felt far away, even when it passed so close. She set the gown gently across her lap and smoothed the silk. Her fingertips traced the faint rise of the darts along the waist, each one lying perfectly flat. The fabric was cool in some places, warm in others, the heat of her hands slowly spreading through it like the slow seep of tea into water. Her thoughts drifted back to the first time she had worked with silk of this shade, years ago for a dress meant for a spring wedding. That one had been lighter in weight, with a tendency to float away under the needle. This silk had more presence, more willingness to rest where it was guided. It made her work easier in one way, yet it carried its own demand for precision. The clock on the shelf marked the hour with a sound so soft she might not have noticed had she been moving. But now she was still, and so she heard it clearly. One measured chime, fading quickly into the hush. She rose to adjust the lantern. The flame caught and swayed, then steadied, throwing a warm glow across the work table. The silk deepened in color under this new light, the rose becoming almost wine dark where the folds overlapped. Returning to her chair, she picked up the lace edging she had set aside earlier. The flowers in its pattern were no larger than her smallest fingernail, each one joined by a loop of fine thread so slender it seemed it might vanish in strong sunlight. She laid it along the cuff of the sleeve, letting her eye follow the natural rhythm of the pattern before choosing her first stitch. It was the kind of task that could not be hurried. Her needle slid through one loop, then into the silk, the thread following silently. She worked steadily, pausing now and again to make sure the lace lay flat, adjusting its position with a gentle tug. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint murmur of voices from somewhere far along the street. The words themselves were lost, leaving only the tone, a mixture of ease and fatigue that marked the close of a working day. She listened for a moment, her hands stilling, then returned to her stitching. The room grew warmer as the lantern's light mingled with the fading glow from the window. The shadows gathered themselves in the corners, soft and deep, making the center of the room feel even more like a small, protected world. When she had finished the lace on the sleeve, she set the gown aside and reached for the small tin of pins. The lid lifted with a quiet pop, revealing the familiar scatter of silver points, each with a round head that caught the light. She poured a few into her palm, feeling their cool, smooth weight, before setting them to one side for the final adjustments she would make in the morning. She let her eyes rest on the gown once more. It was as close to finished as a dress could be before it left the workroom. Only the hem remained, and she would not rush it. Hemming, she thought, was the farewell of dressmaking. The last, quiet conversation between maker and garment before it went out into the world. Beyond the window, the light had thinned to the palest grey. The rooftops were silhouettes now, their sharp edges softened by the early evening air. Somewhere, a bell chimed, not the hour, but something looser, perhaps a church rehearsal or a child's unpracticed play. The sound wavered for a while, then fell silent. She rose and stretched, the movement slow, her hands pressing against the small of her back. Her chair gave its familiar creak as she stepped away from it. Crossing the room, she drew the curtain across the window, shutting out what little remained of the day. The lantern's glow filled the space now, making it feel smaller but warmer, as if the walls themselves had drawn nearer. She liked it this way in the evenings, the sense that the room and the work had gathered close to her, holding her in a shared quiet. Sitting again, she rested her hands on the table and simply breathed for a while, the faint scent of silk and lavender rising in the warmth. There was still work to do tomorrow, but the thought brought no urgency. Tonight was for slow endings. She reached for the gown once more, not to stitch, but to let the fabric slip through her fingers in one long, unbroken movement from bodice to hem. It fell smoothly, without catch or crease, and when she laid it back over the mannequin, it seemed to settle into its own stillness. Her eyes lingered on it as the flame of the lantern flickered once, then steadied. The last light of evening had gone. The workroom belonged entirely to the night now. Chapter 15. The quiet weight of thread. The room seemed to breathe in the lantern's light, each corner softening under its golden reach. The flame swayed once, as if testing the air, then held steady. In that steadiness, the seamstress felt her own breath slow to match. The gown waited for her on the table. The rose silk now deepened to a hue almost like the inside of a shell, muted, glowing from within. She let her fingers rest on it for a moment before taking up the needle again. The thread was fine enough that it almost disappeared when she drew it through her hands, yet she could feel its slight texture, a reminder that even the smallest things have weight. She began at the hem, placing her first stitch as though setting a single stone into the foundation of a wall. The silk folded willingly under her guidance, the edge resting against her palm as the thread bound it into place. Each stitch was a breath, each breath was a moment. The work was unhurried, and she liked it that way. The hem was not merely the end of the gown's making. It was the quiet sealing of all that had gone into it. The hours of cutting, pinning, shaping, smoothing. She sometimes thought of the hem as the point where the garment began to belong to itself, where it could stand or move, apart from her hands. The night outside pressed softly against the window. The curtain swayed faintly, a whisper of air finding its way through the smallest gap. Somewhere down the street, a horse's hooves struck stone, slow, deliberate, and soon gone. She kept stitching. The rhythm was the same as it had been for hours, but each pass of the needle still felt like a small act of care. She imagined the sound the silk might make if it could speak. Not a voice, exactly, but something more like the low hum of a well-tuned instrument, vibrating with the memory of every touch it had known. A memory came to her unbidden, of her grandmother's hands working a mending job on an old wool coat. She remembered watching as a child, fascinated by the speed and certainty of those stitches, the way her grandmother never looked at her fingers yet never faltered. There had been a kind of music in that movement, though no sound came of it. She wondered if, years from now, someone would remember her hands in the same way. Not for the gowns she made, but for the quiet certainty with which she made them. The hem grew longer under her touch, the completed section rolling gently toward the table's edge. She paused to smooth it, pressing her palms lightly along its length. The silk was cool again where it had not touched her skin, warm where it had. She let her hands rest there a moment longer than necessary, as though pressing the memory of the fabric into her own skin. On the shelf nearby, the small clock ticked on. It did not rush her. It had long since learned that her work moved to its own measure. When she reached the end of the thread, she tied it neatly, tucking the knot into the fold so it would never be seen. She clipped the excess with a small pair of scissors, their silver blades catching the lantern light for an instant. The soft snip was the only sound in the room. She threaded the needle again. This time, her gaze lingered on the spool, watching the thread unwind in a smooth, silent ribbon. There was something reassuring in that unspooling, the sense that no matter how much she used, there was always more to give, more to weave into something whole. The curtain shifted again, and she caught a faint scent from outside, wood smoke, mingled with the dampness of the river fog. It carried her mind to another evening, years ago, when she had worked in a room above a bakery. The warm scent of bread had wrapped around her as she stitched, and the faint heat from the ovens had made her drowsy, her needle moving slower and slower until she had forced herself to stand. She smiled at the memory, her hands never pausing in their present work. The gown's skirt pooled against her lap now, its weight both grounding and comforting. She thought about how it would feel to the woman who would wear it, the way the silk would shift with each step, the subtle swish it would make in a quiet room, the way it would catch the light in passing. She imagined that moment, a turn of the head, a glance in a mirror, a faint awareness that something about the gown felt right, even if the wearer could not name why. Perhaps it was because it carried more than fabric and thread. It carried the memory of hands, the patience of hours, the warmth of a small room on a winter's night. Her own reflection caught her eye in the darkened window, head bowed, hair loose, the light from the lantern painting her face in soft gold. She barely recognized herself in those moments, not because she looked different, but because she seemed part of the stillness itself. Another length of the hem was done. She set the needle down and flexed her fingers, rolling her wrists slowly to ease the ache that had settled in the joints. Her hands were not tired in a way that made her wish to stop. They were simply reminding her of the work they had done. On the far wall, a shadow moved. Only the flicker of the lantern, bending the light across the shelves. The sight of it made her think of candlelit rooms she had known in childhood, when shadows had seemed like living things, shifting with every breath of air. She picked up the needle again. The thread slipped easily through the fabric, disappearing into its folds. The soundless song of stitching filled the room once more. The night deepened. The air seemed thicker, holding the warmth of the lantern close. The outside world receded further, until it felt like nothing existed beyond the circle of light in which she worked. She reached the final inches of the hem. There was no rush. In fact, she slowed her hands even more, letting each stitch be deliberate, as though she were saying goodbye to the gown with every pass of the needle. When at last the final knot was tied and hidden, she laid the gown flat on the table. The silk shimmered faintly in the light, each fold resting exactly where it should. She ran her palm along the edge one last time, not to smooth it, but to feel it, the quiet satisfaction of something complete. She leaned back in her chair. The lantern's glow softened the lines of her face, casting her eyes in shadow. She closed them for a moment, listening to the silence. It was a silence she had earned, the kind that comes only after a task has been done with care. The gown would leave soon, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after. But for now it belonged to this room, to her hands, to this quiet night. And so she let it rest. Chapter 16. The Gown in Waiting. The gown lay on the table like a sleeping thing, its folds gathered in stillness, its rose silk deepened in the lantern's glow to something richer, almost secretive. The seamstress sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap, not yet ready to touch it again. She let her gaze rest on it the way one might look at a dear friend, aware that their time together was nearly done. The room held its breath. Even the clock on the shelf seemed quieter, its ticking dulled under the weight of the night. She could hear the faint sound of her own breathing, the rise and fall like the tide against a far-off shore. She had finished the hem hours ago, but she had not yet packed the gown away. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would fold it into its wrapping paper, smooth the creases, and tie the ribbon in a neat bow. Tonight, it would remain here, open to the air, catching the light. Her fingers itched to touch it again. She gave in, rising from her chair and moving toward the table with the slow grace of someone approaching a fragile thing. She let her palm hover above the skirt before letting it fall softly onto the silk. The fabric was cool under her skin, the weight of it spreading gently across her hand. She smoothed it once, twice, the way one might soothe a restless child. In the quiet, she imagined she could feel the pulse of the work within it. Not a heartbeat exactly, but something close. Her eyes wandered to the lace at the neckline, now perfectly joined to the silk. The tiny flowers seemed to bloom under the lantern's light, each petal catching a fraction of its warmth. She remembered the first time she had seen that lace, folded neatly in a merchant's drawer, its ivory edges peeking from brown paper. She had known immediately that it was meant for something special, though she had not yet known what. The gown had grown around that lace in a way. It had been the quiet center, the detail from which everything else unfolded. She traced the seam along the bodice, her fingertips barely brushing the stitches. It pleased her to know that they were nearly invisible, yet strong enough to endure years of wear. That was always her aim, for her work to disappear into the garment, to be felt but not seen. The night outside shifted. A faint gust rattled a loose shutter somewhere along the lane. She glanced toward the window but did not move to look out. The curtain hung heavy, keeping the room's warmth in and the world out. She returned to her chair and sat again, leaning back this time, letting her eyes half close. She thought of the woman who would soon wear the gown. She had met her only once, weeks ago, when measurements were taken. The memory was more of impressions than details, the warmth of her smile, the confidence in the way she stood, the way she had spoken of the evening to come without revealing too much. Would she notice, the seamstress wondered, how the silk shifted when she moved? Would she feel the lace at her collarbone, the way it seemed to rest there as if it had always belonged? Would she sense, without knowing, that the gown had been made not only for her body, but for her night? The thought made her chest ache in that quiet way it sometimes did. Not sorrow, not joy, but something in between. the awareness that her work was always both a beginning and an ending. She reached for her needle once more. There was nothing left to mend, but her hands wanted the feel of it, the small weight of the silver between her fingers. She threaded it without thinking, then let it rest on the table. Her gaze drifted to the shelf above her workbench. It held spools of thread in muted colors, folded swatches of fabric, a scattering of pins in a shallow dish. Above those, tucked between two boxes, was a small, faded photograph. Her mother, standing in the doorway of the old workshop. The edges of the photograph were worn soft from years of handling, but the image remained clear. A woman with steady eyes, a plain dress, and hands that spoke of work done with care. The seamstress looked from the photograph to the gown and back again. She felt the thread that ran between them, not the silk thread in her hands, but the invisible one, binding her to the women who had come before, and perhaps to the women who would come after. The lantern hissed softly, its flame dipping before steadying again. She rose to adjust it, lifting the glass just enough to turn the wick. The light brightened for a moment, then settled, filling the room with that same warm hush she loved. She glanced toward the clock. It was later than she had thought, though the night still felt full. She decided she would sit with the gown a little longer. There was no need to hurry its leaving. She took the dress in her arms, careful not to crease the skirt, and carried it to the mannequin in the corner. She slid it over the form, smoothing the fabric as it settled into place. The mannequin was slightly smaller than the woman for whom the gown was made, but it would do for tonight. Stepping back, she let her eyes travel over it from collar to hem. The gown stood there quietly, its folds catching the light, the lace soft against the shadowed neckline. It looked ready, not just ready to be worn, but ready to live the evening it had been made for. The seamstress circled it slowly, adjusting a fold here, a line there. Her fingertips traced the curve of the skirt as she passed, feeling the shift of the silk beneath them. She knew she would remember the weight of this fabric long after it was gone. When she had completed her circle, she returned to her chair and simply looked. The room seemed different with the gown standing there. Less like a workshop, more like a small, private stage. The lantern played the part of a spotlight, holding the silk in a soft embrace. Her thoughts drifted. She imagined the room empty, the gown gone, the mannequin bare once more. She could almost feel the space it would leave behind, not just in the room, but in her hands. And yet she reminded herself that was the way of all her work. The leaving made room for the next beginning. The thread was cut, the knot tied, and somewhere a new piece waited to be started. The clock ticked on. Outside, the street lay quiet under the weight of the fog. The world felt far away, as though this room existed apart from it, suspended in its own time. She let her eyes close for a moment, the image of the gown still vivid behind them. When she opened them again, nothing had changed. And yet she knew that this was one of her last nights with it. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her chin on her hands. For a long while, she simply watched the way the silk shifted when the lantern flame moved. The gown in waiting. That was what it was now. And she too was waiting for the moment when her hands would let it go. Chapter 17. The last stitches of the night. The fog still clung to the street outside, though she could not see it. She felt it in the quiet, in the way the air seemed to press against the window panes. It was the kind of night the city gave over to lamplight and small circles of warmth, an evening meant for staying inside. The seamstress had left the gown on the mannequin, where it caught the lantern's glow in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though the fabric itself had leaned toward the light. She had stepped back into her chair, but she found herself glancing toward it again and again. as though to reassure herself it was still there. Her hands rested in her lap, loosely folded. She did not feel the need to pick up the needle again. The work was done. The gown no longer belonged to her, not entirely. Yet, for these last hours, it was still within her keeping, and she meant to stay with it. The flame in the lantern wavered slightly, sending a ripple of shadow across the bodice. She watched it shift, how the silk deepened for an instant, then returned to its rose glow. The lace along the neckline held the light differently. It did not shimmer like the silk, but seemed to hold a faint inner brightness of its own, as though it remembered the warmth of her hands when she had sewn it. Her thoughts drifted to the woman who would wear it. She imagined her standing at a mirror, smoothing the skirt, perhaps smiling at her own reflection. She would fasten the clasps at the back, adjust the lace with a fingertip, and then turn away, stepping into a night of music, voices, and the small electric moments that happen when one is dressed for something rare. Would she think of the seamstress at all? Perhaps only briefly, as one might think of the baker who made the bread on the table. And that was fine. The seamstress did not make gowns to be remembered. She made them to be lived in. Still, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing her work would be part of an evening that would never happen again in the same way. A unique fragment of time, stitched into a larger life. She rose once more, drawn toward the gown without fully deciding to move. Standing beside it, she reached out to adjust the fall of the skirt over the mannequin's hip, smoothing it into place with a practiced touch. The fabric sighed faintly under her palm. Her fingertips traced the line of the seam down the side, checking for any unevenness, though she knew there would be none. She could feel the sturdiness beneath the softness, the strength of the work hidden inside. That had always been important to her. A gown should feel delicate, but it must be made to last. She stepped around to the back, her hands moving almost of their own accord to check the closures. The hooks and eyes held fast, each one sewn in place with knots so small they could not be felt from the outside. She gave a gentle tug on the fabric above them, satisfied when it stayed smooth. From the street below came the sound of wheels over cobblestones, a steady rumble that faded quickly. The city seemed to be moving in slow motion tonight, every sound softened by the fog. She thought briefly of her first years in this work, the tiny workshop where she had learned the trade, the smell of steam and pressed fabric, the way her hands had ached after long days. She had not minded then, and she did not mind now. The work had shaped her as much as she had shaped the gowns. Returning to the front of the mannequin, she stood with her arms loosely folded, studying the gown one last time from this angle. The rose silk looked almost copper in the lantern's glow, but she knew it would shift again in daylight. It would take on the cooler tones of the morning, then deepen again under evening lamps. Silk was alive in that way, always changing, always carrying the light differently. She reached for the hem, lifting it slightly to feel its weight. It was not heavy, but it had substance, enough to move with purpose when its wearer walked. The lining was smooth under her fingers, every edge turned neatly, no fraying allowed. Satisfied, she let the hem fall and stepped back. She did not want to overhandle it now. The gown was at its peak, ready to be carried out into the world. Her chair called to her, but instead she crossed to the shelf where her small collection of keepsakes lived. There, in a shallow wooden box, were bits and pieces saved from other gowns. A scrap of velvet, a length of ribbon, a broken clasp with an unusual pattern, a button carved from mother of pearl. She had no practical reason for keeping them. The pieces were too small or too mismatched to be used. But they felt like markers of the years, tokens of work completed. She turned one of the buttons over in her palm, feeling its smooth, cool surface. It caught the lantern light just so, sending a pale gleam across her skin. For a moment she imagined sewing it onto the gown, though she knew it would not suit. The thought made her smile. Replacing the button, she closed the box and returned her gaze to the mannequin. She felt that same familiar ache, the mix of pride and parting. She would never see the gown again once it left. Or if she did, it would be only in passing, on a figure moving quickly through a crowd, the silk a brief flash of color before vanishing again. It was the same with every piece she made, and yet each time it felt different. The lantern's glow had grown softer now, the wick lowering on its own. She would need to trim it soon or let it fade out for the night. But she was not ready for darkness yet. Instead, she crossed to the window and parted the curtain just enough to peer down at the street. The fog swirled faintly in the lamplight below, the cobblestones slick with damp. No one was passing now. The lane was empty. She closed the curtain again and returned to her seat, drawing her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. The air in the room had cooled just enough for her to notice. The clock ticked on, marking the moments until the flame would give out. She thought of lighting a second lantern, but decided against it. Better to let this night end slowly, on its own terms. Her gaze returned to the gown once more, and she knew she would remember this exact image. The way the lace caught the light, the fall of the skirt over the mannequin, the quiet that wrapped around it all. In the morning, she would wrap it carefully in tissue paper, tie it with ribbon, and prepare it for delivery. But tonight, it remained here, part of this small, private world. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes growing heavier with the stillness. Perhaps she would doze for a few minutes before extinguishing the lantern. After all, there was nothing more to do. The last stitches of the night had been made hours ago. And now, all that was left was to keep the gown company until morning. Chapter 18. The quiet farewell. The morning would take it away. That thought, uninvited but steady, had followed her from the moment she opened her eyes. It was not unpleasant, only certain, the way the tide comes in, regardless of whether one is ready. The gown stood in the same place it had the night before, its rose silk catching the soft gold of the lantern's light. But something felt different now. It was as though the air between them held a faint, unspoken knowledge. This was their last night together. She had already prepared the paper and ribbon, laid them neatly on the side table. The wrapping would be done in the morning, after she had checked each seam and pressed the folds one final time. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight was for lingering. She drew her chair closer than usual, so that when she leaned forward, her knees nearly brushed the hem. Resting her elbows on the arms of the chair, she let her hands fall loosely in her lap and simply looked. The silk shifted almost imperceptibly when the lantern's flame moved, its color deepening to copper, then softening again into the muted rose. The lace along the neckline seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it, its small flowers and vines casting the faintest of shadows across the silk beneath. Her eyes followed the lines she knew so well, the gentle curve of the bodice seams, the way they met at the waist, the sweep of the skirt as it fell to the floor. She could trace them blindfolded now, and still her hands would know exactly where they were. She thought of all the hours that lived inside this dress, the first careful cuts into the fabric, the slow pinning of panels, the steady hum of stitches finding their way home. The dress had been only an idea then, lines on paper, a bundle of silk and lace. Now it stood here as something whole, something ready to walk out into the world. She wondered if the woman who had ordered it would sense any of that when she put it on. Some did. Others simply smiled and admired the way it looked, never thinking about the hours or the hands behind it. She did not mind which it was. Once a gown left her care, it was free to live however it would. Still, there was a tenderness in this parting. The city outside seemed to understand. It was one of those fog-heavy nights that softened every edge. Through the window, the light from the street lamps blurred into glowing halos, the cobblestones wet and glistening. A single carriage passed, its wheels muffled, its lanterns small flickers swallowed quickly by the mist. She rose and crossed to the window, placing her palm against the cool glass. The gown's reflection hovered beside her in the pane, the two of them side by side. She stood there for a long moment before letting the curtain fall back into place. On the table, a small cup of tea had gone lukewarm, but she drank from it anyway. It wasn't for the heat now, it was for the familiar taste, the way it grounded her in the rhythm of her evenings. Returning to the gown, she reached out and let her fingertips brush the skirt, just enough to feel the silk move under her touch. It made the faintest sound, like a whisper. She smoothed the fabric where her hand had passed, not to correct anything but to acknowledge it. The hem, she noticed, held a slight curve at one side. Not an error, just the way the fabric had settled overnight. She knelt to coax it back into place, letting the silk fall from her fingers in slow waves until it hung evenly again. From this angle she could see the underside of the skirt where the lining met the seam. Her stitches there were neat and tight, invisible unless one went looking. She liked that about her work, that its truest strength was hidden. Rising again, she stepped back and took in the whole of it once more. There was nothing more to be done tonight, but still she stayed close. The lantern threw a warm halo that seemed to wrap both of them in a quiet that belonged to no one else. Her mind wandered to the first gown she had ever sent out into the world on her own. She had been nervous then, afraid she might have missed something. But when she saw it later, walking past on a stranger, she had felt a small, private joy. The dress had moved well. It had lived. This one, she thought, would do the same. The clock on the shelf gave a soft tick, reminding her how late it had grown. She should sleep, but she knew she wouldn't just yet. The night felt too much like a final conversation. One of those moments where you stay a little longer, even after you've said everything that needs to be said. She lit a second, smaller lamp and placed it at the far corner of the table. Its light reached the gown from another angle, changing the shadows, bringing out a faint sheen in the folds that the first lantern had left in darkness. She liked seeing it this way, as though she were meeting it again for the first time. For a while she simply sat, letting her thoughts drift with the play of light across silk. There was a calm in this, the kind of calm that only comes when something is complete. Eventually she stood and crossed to the shelf where the tissue paper waited. She ran her hand over the stack, smooth, cool, and rustling softly under her touch. In the morning, these sheets would be folded around the gown like a cloud, the ribbon tied in a steady bow. But tonight, the gown would remain as it was, standing freely, breathing the last hours of its time here. The flame in the main lantern lowered a fraction, its glow deepening. She took that as her cue to draw her shawl closer and sink back into her chair. The air was cooler now, the sounds from the street almost gone. Her eyes lingered on the dress until they began to blur with drowsiness. She would not fight it. Tomorrow would come soon enough. For now, she let the quiet take her, the gown still in its place, the silk holding the light like a secret. And when the last of the night passed, they would part, but only after this final, perfect hush. Chapter 19, Morning's Gentle Hand. Morning did not rush in. It arrived softly, as though it too understood that the day would carry a farewell. When the seamstress opened her eyes, the room was already washed in a pale, muted light. It slipped in through the thin curtain, diffused by the lingering fog that had yet to lift from the streets. The city was still half asleep. No clatter of wheels yet, no shouted greetings from one doorway to another. only the occasional muffled tread of boots below, and even that seemed gentled by the damp air. She sat up slowly, letting the warmth of her blanket linger for a moment before swinging her feet to the floor. The boards were cool under her soles. She reached for her shawl, pulling it around her shoulders as she crossed to the table where the gown waited. It was just as she had left it. Poised, still, its rose silk holding the faintest trace of the lantern's glow from the night before, as if it had stored it somewhere within its folds. She stood there for a long time without touching it, simply looking, the way one does when trying to commit a thing to memory in all its detail. Then she drew a slow breath and began. The final checks came first. She ran her fingers along every seam, feeling for any small rise or catch that might betray a stitch out of place. Her fingertips found only the smooth, steady lines she had set there. She examined the hem, tilting it toward the light to be sure the folds lay as they should. She checked the lace once more, each small flower secure, each vine resting as though it had always belonged to the silk. There was nothing to correct. She lit the small iron and set it to warm on the corner of the table, then spread a pressing cloth over the gown's bodice. The steam rose in soft clouds, carrying with it the faint scent of the fabric itself. Not quite floral, not quite mineral, something between the two. She pressed each section with slow, even passes, lifting the iron rather than sliding it when she moved from one place to the next. The silk responded with a quiet gleam, its surface smoothing under her care. When she was done, she stepped back again. The gown stood ready now, not just in the sense of being finished, but in the way a thing can seem to know its own moment has come. From the shelf, she took the stack of tissue paper she had prepared. The first sheet she laid across the table, then gently lifted the skirt to rest upon it. The fabric poured into place like water, settling into soft, natural folds. Another sheet followed, drawn lightly over the bodice, then tucked along the sides. She folded the paper in layers, each one cushioning the silk without pressing it flat. The ribbon was last. She chose the pale ivory one, not too bright, not too stark, a quiet complement to the rose silk hidden beneath. She tied it in a bow with even loops, adjusting the tails until they lay just so. The gown was a parcel now, though to her it was still the same living thing it had been moments ago. She rested her hands lightly on the wrapped bundle for a moment, not in possession, but in parting. The knock came sooner than she expected. It was not loud, just a polite, measured rap on the door. She crossed the room and opened it to find a young man in a dark coat, his collar turned up against the damp. In his hands he carried a small slip of paper with the client's name and address. "Here for the delivery," he said, his voice respectful, as though he knew he had stepped into a space that preferred quiet. She nodded and stepped back to retrieve the parcel. When she placed it in his arms, she adjusted her grip at the last moment, letting it go slowly, so that the silk had one final instant in her keeping before it passed into his. "Handle it gently," she said, though she knew he would. "I will," he promised, inclining his head before turning toward the stair. She watched from the doorway as he descended, the pale bundle resting easily against his chest. At the bottom, the door to the street opened, and the fog reached in like a soft hand to take it. Then both were gone. For a moment she remained there, her fingers curled loosely against the doorframe. The absence was not sharp, not like the loss of something that cannot be replaced, but it was present all the same. The space in the room where the gown had stood felt larger now, the table bare without its weight. She closed the door and crossed back to the chair by the window. The city was beginning to wake in earnest now. Somewhere nearby a baker's bell rang, and the smell of warm bread drifted faintly upward. A cart rattled past, its wheels finding the uneven stones with more clamour than grace. She sat for a while with her hands folded, not yet reaching for the next length of fabric, though she knew it waited on the shelf. These pauses were rare, the in-between spaces when one piece had gone and the next had not yet begun. She let herself feel it fully. The quiet pride, the clean emptiness, the sense of something complete. Later she would take down the new silk, lay out the pattern, and begin again. Another gown, another story stitched into its seams. But for now, she simply watched the fog lift over the city, the rooftops emerging one by one into the pale light of day. Chapter 20. The Day Between. Morning came without fanfare, the light outside the seamstress's window pale and uncertain, the kind that made it difficult to tell whether the day was truly awake or still stretching in its sleep. The fog had not lifted fully. It hung low between the rooftops, softening the edges of the chimneys and blurring the further streets into suggestion. From somewhere below, she heard the faint clink of bottles being loaded into a cart, the muted rhythm of hooves on damp stone. She rose slowly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders before moving to the work table. The gown from the night before waited in its place, the silk folds resting easily over the form, as though the night had smoothed away any last memory of her hands. She set her palm against it for a moment, feeling the fabric's cool surface yield faintly beneath her touch. Today was not a day for finishing, not yet. There were still smaller tasks to be done. The seams at the inner bodice, the lining along the waist, a few final adjustments to the sleeves. The work would take the better part of the day, and she welcomed the thought of it. The kind of tasks ahead were quiet ones, the sort that drew her inward and let the outside world dissolve into background. She sat, threading her needle with the same measured care as always, and began on the bodice lining. The silk lining was the palest shade of cream, chosen not for show. It would be hidden once the dress was complete, but for the way it felt under the fingers. She pressed it into place and stitched in a steady rhythm, the fine thread disappearing almost instantly into the seam. Each pass of the needle was accompanied by the faint whisper of silk on silk, a sound too soft for anyone but her to notice. Now and then she paused to tilt her head, checking the symmetry of the curve, the lie of the lining against the outer fabric. The precision mattered, even here in the places no eye would see. She believed, though she had never said so aloud, that the unseen parts of a garment carried something of their making. A rushed seam might hold tension. An uneven stitch might whisper of neglect. She preferred to leave behind only calm. Outside, the sounds of the street shifted with the hours. The clatter of carts gave way to the sharper, intermittent tapping of boots, then to a slower lull as midday approached. The fog lingered stubbornly, muting even the calls of the vendors who sometimes passed below. Their words reached her only as rounded notes of sound, too softened to decipher. She worked on until the lining was complete, then turned her attention to the sleeves. The fit had to be exact, close enough to follow the line of the arm, loose enough to allow easy movement. She unpinned one side and made a slight adjustment, then checked it against the other. A dress, she always thought, should move as though it belonged to the body wearing it, never resisting, never dragging against it. She stitched the altered seam slowly, letting the thread lie flat with each pass. The wool creased faintly beneath her hands, holding the memory of her touch until she smoothed it away. She pressed the seam with the side of her palm before setting the sleeve upright again. By mid-afternoon, the light outside had thinned further, the fog growing heavier rather than lifting. The air in the room felt close, carrying the faint scent of the tea she had poured earlier, but never finished. She rose to open the window a fraction, letting in a cooler breath of air. The sound of the street rose with it, a cartwheel catching against the cobblestone, a brief burst of laughter, the squeal of a distant hinge. When she returned to the table, she spread the skirt across it for one last check. The hem was still unpinned, the fabric pooled pooling in generous folds at her side. She ran her hand along its edge, noting where it dipped or rose against the straight grain. She would level it tomorrow, once the fabric had rested fully in its final drape. There was something about this stage of work, not yet finished, yet no longer raw, that always left her both content and restless. The dress was nearly itself now, but not quite ready to step into the world. It was a day between, a pause before the last notes of making were added. She lit the lamp early, the fog outside dimming the room sooner than usual. Its warm circle of light fell over the gown, softening the sheen of the silk and deepening the shadows in its folds. She took up her needle again and began on the inner seams of the skirt, the work slow but steady. Her hands found their rhythm easily, and soon the outside world faded entirely, leaving only the feel of the cloth and the small, familiar motions. As evening pressed in, she set her work aside to tend the fire in the small grate. The flames caught reluctantly, but soon the room filled with a gentle heat that settled into the walls. She returned to her chair with a fresh spool of thread, the lamplight catching on the silver glint of her scissors as she passed them. The last task of the night was to check the bodice against the skirt, ensuring that the two sat together without pulling or gaping. She adjusted a few pins, then stepped back to view the dress as a whole. Even in its incomplete state, it carried a quiet grace, the kind that came not from ornament, but from balance. She left it on the form when she finally rose to put her tools away. The room was silent now except for the faint crackle of the fire and the softened tick of the clock. She drew the curtains against the fog, the lamplight within making the window a darkened mirror. For a moment she caught her own reflection there, a figure in shadow, hands still, the faint curve of a smile at the corner of her mouth. Tomorrow she would begin the final work, but tonight she let the gown stand in its place, the lines of it clear against the dim room, holding the quiet of the day between. Chapter 21. The Quiet Between Stitches. The day after the gown's departure dawned without hurry. Pale light brushed against the curtains, dim enough that it could have been mistaken for the hour before sunrise. The seamstress woke to the familiar creak of the rafters above her bed, the soft, settling sound of wood shifting in the cool air. She lay there for a few moments, not yet moving, listening to the muted voice of the city as it stirred to life. The gown was gone, but its presence lingered in the room. Not physically, there was only the empty space on the work table now, but in the air, in the quiet. The memory of the silk's weight, the subtle sound of its folds settling, seemed to hover in the stillness. She knew this would fade, as it always did, replaced by the living rhythm of new work. But for now, she let the absence be what it was, an echo, soft but steady. She rose, pulled her shawl around her shoulders and crossed to the window. The street below lay beneath a thin veil of mist, enough to blur the edges of passing shapes, but not enough to hide them entirely. She could see a man carrying a crate of apples, the red skins dulled by the fog. A woman passed him with a basket hooked over one arm, the smell of fresh bread following in her wake. The seamstress's gaze drifted upward to the sky, a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that promised neither rain nor clear sunshine. She let the curtain fall back into place and turned to the table. There, waiting in a neat folded stack, lay the fabric for her next commission. It was not silk this time, but a soft dove-grey wool, smooth and supple beneath the hand. The client had asked for a walking dress, something practical yet elegant, meant for the cooler days that would soon arrive. The wool had a faint warm scent, like air caught in a cedar-lined chest, and when she smoothed her palm over it, she felt the gentle resilience of its weave. She unrolled it slowly, letting the length spill across the table. The light from the window caught on its subtle sheen, revealing the way the fibers shifted shade depending on the angle, now silvered, now deepening toward charcoal. She liked fabrics like this, ones that had their own quiet depth without needing embellishment. From the small drawer beneath the table, she took her shears, their handles worn smooth from years of use. The first cut was always made in silence. She aligned the fabric carefully, the pattern pieces laid out with precise spacing, and then pressed the blade down with a steady hand. The shears closed with a muted snick, the sound satisfying in its clean finality. Piece by piece, the shape of the dress began to emerge from the yardage. Sleeves here, bodice there, the gentle curve of the skirt's hem traced and released from the whole. She stacked each cut section in careful order, the edges aligned, the weight of them balanced, so no piece would crease before she was ready to sew it. She threaded her needle with a soft grey silk, not exactly the same hue as the wool, but close enough to vanish when the work was done. As the thread slid between her fingers, she thought of how different this would feel from the last gown. Wool was more forgiving than silk, less prone to slipping away from the needle's point. Yet it too demanded respect. Too much tension and it would pucker, too little and the seams would lack strength. The first stitches were small, almost hesitant, as though she and the fabric were learning one another's pace. The wool welcomed the needle without resistance, closing around the thread as if it had always been there. She found the rhythm quickly. In, pull, smooth. In, pull, smooth. The same old pattern that felt as natural to her hands as breathing. Outside, the city's voice began to rise. The fog thinned, and the clatter of hooves reached her from further up the street. Somewhere, a boy called out the morning's headlines, his voice bright and cutting through the muffled air. The seamstress heard it all without losing her focus. The sound became part of the background hum that accompanied her work, much like the ticking clock or the faint scratch of the thread as it slid home. She paused now and then to sip from a small cup of tea resting on the corner of the table. The steam curled upward in thin ribbons, carrying the faint scent of bergamot. She liked to keep her tea close, but not too near the fabric. A lesson learned long ago after an accidental spill that had left a pale stain on a nearly finished hem. By midday, the first seams were done. She set the bodice pieces together, pinning them with long glass-headed pins that caught the light in tiny flashes. As she adjusted the fit on the dress form, she thought of the client's description, how she wanted the dress to move easily, to feel light despite the warmth of the wool. The seamstress lifted and shaped the fabric until the shoulders fell just so, until the line from collar to waist felt as fluid as a drawn breath. She stepped back and studied the work, tilting her head slightly. The grey wool looked serene in the daylight, its folds catching shadows that lent it a quiet dignity. It was a very different beauty from the rose silk, yet it stirred the same sense of purpose in her. The afternoon light grew warmer as she worked on the sleeves, the sun finally breaking through the haze outside. The beams angled through the window, stretching across the table to rest on the scattered scraps of cloth. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, catching gold as they passed through the light. As the day edged toward evening, she lit the lantern once more. The room shifted with its glow, the pale grey of the wool taking on a faint amber cast. Her hands worked steadily, coaxing the pieces into shape, the fabric growing more and more into its final form. When she finally set the needle down, the first stage was complete. The walking dress was not yet ready, but its structure was there, the promise of what it would become. She draped it over the dress form and stepped back. The light outside had dimmed again, the last of the sun slipping behind the rooftops. She could hear the evening crowd moving through the street, voices mingling with the sound of doors closing and shutters being drawn. She poured herself another cup of tea and sat for a while, watching the lantern light trace along the curves of the unfinished dress. Tomorrow she would continue, adding the collar, shaping the skirt, finishing the seams. But tonight, she let the quiet settle in around her. The room felt full again. Not in the way it had when the rose silk gown had stood in the corner, but in a new way, as though the space itself understood that the cycle had begun anew, that the quiet between stitches was simply another part of the making. And so she sat there, the wool waiting patiently on its form, and allowed herself the comfort of knowing that every seam she had ever sewn, every gown or dress that had passed through her hands, had left something behind in the air, an invisible pattern, a map of care and attention that no passing of time could erase. Chapter 22. The dress that waited for its day. The following morning broke in a silver haze. A thin light seeped through the curtains, neither warm nor cold, as though the sun itself was undecided about showing its full face. The seamstress rose early, her mind already moving toward the grey wool dress. She had left it draped on the form overnight so that the fabric might rest and settle into its shape. A small kindness she always allowed before the final stages. The room felt hushed in that way mornings sometimes do, when the world outside has yet to properly stir. She crossed to the work table, fingers brushing the smooth grain of the wood before settling on the dress. The wool had softened subtly overnight, the folds falling more naturally now. She smoothed the skirt with the flat of her palm, feeling the quiet give in the cloth, and thought, as she always did in this moment, of the journey from bolt to garment. There was a kind of intimacy in this stage of making. Every piece was now joined, yet still open to change, still waiting for the last shaping that would bring the whole into perfect balance. She picked up her chalk and marked a few final adjustments, here at the shoulder seam, there along the curve of the sleeve, before threading her needle once more. The first task was the collar. She had chosen a high, gently rounded style, the sort that would sit close to the neck without stiff formality. The wool was lined with a narrow strip of silk, pale and almost hidden, there purely for comfort. As she sewed, she imagined the feel of it against skin on a crisp autumn day, soft enough to be forgotten, yet present enough to hold warmth in place. Her stitches here were deliberate and fine, the thread vanishing into the wool almost as soon as it passed through. She paused now and then to smooth the curve, ensuring it sat evenly on both sides. The collar, though small, was like the quiet frame around a portrait, unobtrusive yet guiding the eye. Once the collar was complete, she turned her attention to the skirt's hem. This was the longest stretch of sewing in the entire dress, the work made slower by her desire to keep each stitch invisible from the outside. She laid the skirt across her lap, letting its weight settle. The wool was warmer than silk, holding the memory of her hands as she worked. Outside, the street was beginning to wake in earnest. The sound of wheels over cobblestones drifted upward, along with the low rumble of distant voices. A faint breeze carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a vendor's cart, mingling with the faint aroma of her cooling tea on the table. She bent again to her work, her hands moving without haste. There was no reason to rush. The dress would be ready by day's end. As she worked, she thought of the woman who had ordered it. She had been quiet in her request, offering no elaborate explanation, only that she wanted something she could walk in comfortably through the streets without drawing unwanted attention. Yet the seamstress had noticed the way her eyes had rested on the sample stitches, the way her fingers had brushed over the grey wool with something like fondness. The hem was finished by mid-afternoon. She set the dress upright on the form and stepped back to take it in fully. It stood with a kind of poised stillness, the skirt falling in clean lines, the sleeves balanced in their taper. The grey wool caught the softened daylight, its subtle sheen lending depth to every fold. It was not a gown meant to dazzle, but it held its own quiet beauty, the kind that only revealed itself over time, in the way it moved, the way it belonged to its wearer. She fetched the buttons from their small paper envelope. Each was a smooth, matte black, cool under her fingers. She set them in a neat row down the bodice, the placement as precise as any seam. One by one, they were sewn into place, their small weight anchoring the wool just enough to give structure without stiffness. She ran her fingertips lightly over them when she was done, feeling the slight variation in each, the tiny imperfections that spoke of their making. When all was finished, she took the dress from the form and held it in her hands. It had a different weight now, not heavier exactly, but more complete, more certain of itself. She turned it slowly, watching how the light shifted across it, and felt the same quiet satisfaction she always did in this moment. The making was done. The dress was ready to leave her hands. But she did not pack it away just yet. Instead, she placed it on the hook by the window, where the soft light could reach it as the afternoon faded toward evening. She tidied her work table, folding the leftover scraps and sweeping away the fine threads that had gathered in the corners. She wiped the shears before returning them to their place, the click of the drawer closing sounding louder in the stillness than she expected. Outside, the mist had begun to return, blurring the outlines of the street once more. Lamps flickered to life in the distance, their reflections trembling faintly on the damp stones. The seamstress lit her lantern and sat for a time with her hands folded in her lap, simply watching the light shift across the folds of the wool dress. Tomorrow, the client would come. The dress would leave this quiet room, carrying with it the hours, the care, the small unspoken attention stitched into every seam. The seamstress would return to her table, to whatever fabric awaited her next. The cycle would continue, as it always had. But tonight, she let the stillness linger. She imagined the dress walking through the streets on some cool, bright morning, the sound of footsteps blending with the rhythm of its movement. She imagined the feel of it, warm, light, steady, against the skin of the one who wore it. And in the soft lamplight glow of her workshop, the seamstress felt what she always did at the end of a piece. Not loss, but a gentle release. The dress no longer belonged to her, yet some part of it always would, just as some part of her would remain with it, woven into the quiet between stitches. Chapter 23. The Quiet After. The morning was brighter than she expected, not clear exactly. The sky still wore its veil of pale cloud, but the fog had at last pulled back from the narrow lanes, revealing rooftops and chimneys that had been hidden for days. The air had that cool, clean scent that comes after a long, damp spell, and when she opened the window a fraction, it carried in the faint salt of the river. The gown was finished. It stood on the form in the center of the room, the folds of the skirt settling naturally as though it had always belonged there. The silk's sheen shifted with the light, running from soft rose to deeper wine tones, the color alive in the morning glow. She had pressed each seam before the dawn, letting the steam rise around her hands, smoothing away the last faint creases from the work. She walked slowly around it now, her fingers trailing lightly just above the surface. The dress breathed in its own way, not with air, but with the life stitched into it over hours and nights. Every seam held the quiet of those evenings, the warmth of the lantern, the rhythm of needle and thread, the patience of hands that had never hurried. It would be collected this afternoon. The client would climb the stairs with the soft firmness of someone who knew the worth of what she had come for, and she would stand just there by the table while the gown was unpinned from its form and folded into layers of clean tissue. There would be polite words, perhaps admiration for the lace, perhaps only a quiet nod, and then the rustle of silk as it left the room. The seamstress did not feel sadness at this thought. Dresses, she had learned, were like moments. They could not be held beyond their time. They belonged to the movement of life, to the steps and turns and rooms they would pass through after they left her hands. Still, she gave herself this morning to be with it. She sat in her chair, the gown before her, and let her gaze soften until it was no longer fabric she saw, but the evening stitched into it. The faint strain in her thumb from holding the needle too long, the way the lace had resisted at first before settling under her touch, the sound of hoofbeats fading into fog. All of it was there, quiet and complete. The fire in the grate was only embers now, but their warmth lingered in the small room. The clock on the shelf ticked steadily, marking a time that felt slower than the world outside. She thought of the street below, the carts beginning their rounds, the vendors opening shutters, the steady flow of the city beginning again, and felt no pull to be among them. Here, she was already where she needed to be. She rose after a while to prepare the wrapping. From the cupboard, she took the wide sheet of white tissue, smoothing it flat over the table. It made the faintest sigh as she unfolded it, the sound almost lost beneath the whisper of her own breath. She laid out the ribbon that would tie it, the soft grey one she saved for the finest gowns. When the time came, she would lift the gown gently from its form, letting the skirt fall once more into her hands before folding it into the tissue. She would not hurry. The silk deserved to remember the ease with which it had been made. For now she left it standing. She poured tea and sat again by the window, the cup warm between her palms. Outside, the air was alive with small movements. A bird settling on the slate roof across the lane, the flutter of laundry being hung in a yard below, the faint murmur of voices in the street. All ordinary things, but they felt part of the same thread as the gown, each holding its own small perfection, unnoticed unless one cared to look. Her eyes drifted to the shelf above the work table, where the tin box sat with its dented corner. She did not open it today. The buttons inside would keep their place for another time. Today was for completion, for allowing what was finished to simply be. As the hour drew closer to the appointment, she moved without hurry. She folded away her tools, set her chair neatly back beneath the table, and swept the last stray threads from the floor. She lit the lamp despite the daylight, its golden circle of light a familiar comfort. When the knock came at the door, she was ready. The client's voice was warm but brief, her eyes moving over the gown with a satisfaction that needed no words. Together they lifted it from the form, the seamstress supporting the weight of the skirt, while the client smoothed the bodice. It folded into the tissue like water finding its level, each layer settling against the next. The ribbon closed it neatly, the knot secure but gentle. The parcel was lifted, the door closed. Footsteps faded down the stairs, then into the street. The room was quiet again. She stood for a moment, hands resting lightly on the back of her chair, and let the silence settle. There was a faint space where the gown had stood, as though the air still held its outline. The absence was not empty. It was full in its own way, filled with the echo of the work and the stillness that had shaped it. She turned to the window once more. The clouds had shifted slightly, letting through a thin wash of late light. Somewhere along the lane, a violin had begun to play. Not a performance, just a quiet, unhurried melody drifting from an open window. It wound through the air and into her room, and she let it stay there, part of the quiet after. Tomorrow, another piece would begin. Another length of cloth would be unrolled. Another set of stitches would find their way into form. But tonight, there would be only this: a chair, a small fire, a window onto the soft hum of the city, and the space left behind by something well made. The day folded into evening. The light drew in. The corners of the room deepened. And in that deepening she sat, content in the knowledge that her work had gone where it was meant to go, carrying with it the hush and patience of the hands that had made it.